I'm really delighted to join you. I had the opportunity when I was waiting online for the panel with Mary O'Kane speaking and Robert Glasser on Wednesday, although I have to say that feels many, many, many days ago, not just a day and a half ago. But it was great to hear their contributions, and I'm really sorry I've not been able to join you this week. Unfortunately, or fortunately, I'm in Canberra for assisting the Commonwealth in respect of the Robo-Debt Royal Commission. So in discussions with Andrew, we talked about, how I could potentially contribute to this research forum. And for those who were listening to our banter earlier, you would have heard some of the reasons why I agreed and was keen to become a director of Natural Hazards Research Australia. I wanted to continue to contribute to and support Australia's disaster arrangements, and also to help explain through today ways in which those that are undertaking scientific research and social research and other forms of research can contribute to the shaping of public policy and strategy through the Royal Commission and Public Inquiry lens and forum. So that's how I've come about sort of pulling together today the things I want to mention to you. And I think it helps in commencing is to understand the lens through which these bodies operate. They've become an entrenched feature of Australian public life, although they have been used as a method of analysing and developing policy proposals throughout Australia's history, near history. I would expect they will continue to be used as a method because they have those qualities of independence, neutrality, and importantly, transparency. And for those reasons, they are very attractive to government. They can help them fill a gap they don't have. They can deal with something immediately. There's a certain impetus to royal commissions and public inquiries. Things that are very complex, that have a whole lot of stakeholders, can be brought together through this process. And they can also help get to the root of a problem and investigate allegations, for example, of impropriety, where government or people who work within government have been involved. But it's useful to understand that they are just part of the executive. They're generally ad hoc, that is from time to time. The only sort of standing royal commissions in Australia are ICAC and IBAC, those kinds of standing corruption bodies for investigation, and now the coming federal one. And as a consequence, they are shaped by their terms of reference, which are established by government but formally promulgated by the Governor-General or a state governor. And increasingly, they're done by joining Commonwealth and state powers to establish these sort of overarching royal commissions. And their sort of natural hazard and disaster world is really clearly not something that's located to just any one locality. And of course, they have powers that are really quite extraordinary. And everyone often thinks about the compulsory powers, but actually they have a lot of other useful powers, for example, requiring the production of statements of information. And what I want to sort of talk to you about is the whole other ways that royal commissions work to gather evidence that can be used to shape the analysis and development of policy. And why is that? Why would an expert, anyone sitting in the forum today or watching online, want to contribute? What's the sort of purpose of doing it? Well, it's because you can actually influence the outcome and affect change. And I think one of the big issues that Natural Hazards Research Australia is seeking to do is to be very conscious about how research will be utilised. How will it have an end use, an end goal in terms of either assisting those within the emergency management sector or underpinning of our general, our more specific knowledge, new ways of policy implementation and so on. And there's a very useful book, and I would have liked to have discussed it with the author if I'd managed to be present in Queensland, called Public Inquiries, Policy Learning and the Threat of Future Crises. And I really do recommend it to everybody, because this slide is adapted from that book, because it brings together a really under-considered area of the importance of royal commissions and public inquiries in shaping public policy. In everyone's mind, they do very much tend to focus on them being chaired by former judges or lawyers, and being very judicial and legal in their focus. And if you're legal in your focus, you'll tend to look for legal solutions and legal recommendations. But the opportunity to have a broader effect and to contribute to a more systemic approach to investigations and recommendations can be done through the engagement of experts. So there's a whole, and considering your own particular area of research interest, I raise all of these as being something that you might seek to drive to by contributing to a Royal Commission. Now, and just for the benefit of those listening who can't or will be looking at a transcript, those include changing the behaviour of government or policy actors by helping improve their understanding, by changing organisational routines so that collective activities or institutional memory are going to be shaped, to change what are existing systems and policies for the better, maybe to change assumptions and values or norms that underpin policies, to help draft and propose new or better policy instruments, and working constructively through reflections and deliberations. And then through policy redesign and reconstruction in a way that helps those, not just within the community, but those who only think that it's an issue that's at the periphery, to understand that it's actually very vital, or they need to have a better informed basis for how the debate can engage in the policy in the public domain. And finally, to help those who do engage through the Royal Commission to better understand how they can refine, pitch their ideas, pitch their concerns, and then help them then communicate it better to the Royal Commission, through the Royal Commission, and subsequently in general and continuing public policy development. So I'm going to take you through a couple of examples of experts in action. And these are all drawn from Alistair Stark's book, but they're just, I raise them because they're a good example of showing you that experts are used in Royal Commissions, and it's not just lawyers talking to other lawyers and eviscerating witnesses. The UK Pitt Review had a scientific and engineering panel comprising of engineers, hydrologists and geographers, and they had a positive obligation to challenge ideas and research and conclusions that were being formulated by the review. And that's a really potentially vital tool, particularly in something of this kind. If you think about some of the inquiries that have been held recently, having an independent panel formally appointed is another means to bring that expertise into a commission. Other ways that it's done is by, for example, selecting not just having one commissioner, but by having a panel of commissioners. The second example, again, one of engineering expertise being brought into in that way through commissioners in the New Zealand Canterbury Earthquakes Commission. And sometimes you'll get arguments or discussions about who might be a good contributor or leader of a commission. And here's an example of having both bringing engineering expertise, but bringing one from a business background and one academic. And finally, the Bushfires Royal Commission, which had an actual large policy-oriented research team who published a series of research reports, public discussion papers, and information panels. And what you see with both those, both the Earthquakes Commission and the Bushfires Royal Commission, and thus in the Natural Disasters Royal Commission, is having these so-called hot tub expert panel hearings where you put a number of experts together and have them exchange ideas, exchange their research, comment on each other's research, and in a sense, a live peer review. And there's certainly more scope for that to happen, in my view. So looking at the Natural Disasters Royal Commission, and I'm going to talk to you a bit how the Commission came to form conclusions that were driven by the scientific evidence, forming a view and finding that the disaster outlook is alarming and requires a fundamental shift in strategic thinking about natural disaster risk management, and recommending a range of activities that needed to happen and policy reform that needed to happen to deal with natural hazard events which will be more frequent and severe under climate change. It was very gratifying after the report was published that those with expertise, in the general science and scientific research community were positive about the body of evidence that was collected and the way it was distilled. And it hopefully remains a resource for researchers, both the report itself, which is thoroughly supported by citations and so on, but also all the material remains on the website and is available to further expand knowledge. And I said I would talk about how it informed the conclusions that the Commission drew. Obviously, that Royal Commission was promulgated at a time when there was still some public debate about climate change, and there wasn't an express term of reference about climate change, but rather it accepted as a premise that there was a changing climate. So the role of counsel assisting is to select witnesses and to think about how to bring to life the terms of reference for the commissioners. And so what we did was we began by having live presentations by scientific experts to enable the right issues to be brought to the front. And those were risk. Robert Glasser said the other day how important it is to frame issues through a risk lens, and I'm a complete believer in that. And so we began with identifying what were the natural hazard risks to Australia. And one of the things that's important in considering how you communicate the research that you do is to think about how will you communicate it to the untutored, to those who know nothing about it. And one of the extraordinary advantages of being forced to run this Royal Commission completely online was that we were able to use the videos and PowerPoint presentations and short animations to distill huge bodies of research into very persuasive and summaries and highlights of the critical issues. And so I commissioned the Bureau of Meteorology, CSIRO, and Geoscience Australia to prepare, I think they were 30 minutes or 15-minute presentations for the commissioners. And these are still all, they're still all on the website and on YouTube, to communicate these key issues and speak with authority that they have of both their positions and their organisations, so that there was accepted as a commencing foundation the scientific evidence. And then from there, we then built the rest of the sort of issues and lived experience and emergency management response, all those other stories within that framework of what is the picture for Australia in terms of its disaster risk outlook. So I also wanted to mention that you can see a form of a hot tub. It's the panel of New South Wales emergency leaders. Now, that's that idea of having a number of people commenting on each other. There's actually other ones where there were, as you may recall, having different states all commenting on each other, which was really a remarkable ability to distill those different experiences and make it become clear to everybody that there are different issues in different parts of Australia, partly as a function of geography, partly a function of population centres and their locations, and so on. And I think persisting in this systemic view is so vital to engaging with Australia's future natural hazard risks and potential for disasters. I also just including here, just to give a sense of the range of ways of material that was contributed, if you don't even know. The list of experience and expertise that was provided just by way of submissions contributed through the public portal. All of them, I've included those links. They're all there. And you can see that they were very, very persuasive in helping the Commission build this detailed picture. So what's your job to go from here? Well, as I said, a lot of the ways we found out about witnesses was they made a submission. They wrote into the inquiry, they contributed what they had done already, either by providing copies of the research that they had, identifying issues that should be explored either in research or because of the research and what it had demonstrated. So think about how, if you're doing that, how you will pitch that to an inquiry. Why would they want to take you on? How can you contribute and explain? It can be utilised both through the process and its ultimate policy outcome. These days, there's always some kind of community forum which is picking up the experience of others, and that's a really useful way to proceed, to participate in expert forums. There's always published background papers and issues papers, and you can usually respond through those. You might engage through that formal process that I mentioned before of responding to formal notices of production and providing detailed statements. That might be a function of the institution, for example, or your own notoriety, and appearing as witnesses. But the one I would really like to have you engage with is to look carefully at any draft recommendations or final submissions, because the impact of Royal Commission recommendations in Australia's current public policy environment is they're invariably accepted. Now, whether they're fully implemented is a different issue, and I'll come to that, but they're invariably accepted. So it's really vital to have those with expertise injecting it into that phase so that there is something evidence-based that enables the policy and strategy that is formulated from it to be well informed and to be have the best potential outcome. And finally, the one I would ask those who have the energy to do it is to track those changes and critique the changes if they're being implemented. One of the great, in some respects, farces of Australia's history of natural disaster inquiries is that there are so many inquiry reports and a lot of them get left on the shelf. Now, the Bushfires and Natural Hazards CRC has a tremendous online portal where it gathers all historic reports and inquiries. And one of the things that the Commission recommended is its papers remain available and be tracked for their implementation. And so I leave that as a challenge for you. If you're in an area that has had an area of research that has had a Royal Commission or other public inquiry make a recommendation, look at it, critique it, find ways that it could be done better or whether it needs to be revisited, and join that community of ensuring that that work has not gone to waste and that we don't fail to learn the lessons of history. Thanks very much, Andrew.
Thanks, Dominique. We have time for one quick question for you. I'm going to take the one here from Melissa Parsons. So, why does it take a Royal Commission to achieve step changes in policy? Shouldn't the principles of review just be a normal function of good government and good governance?
Look, I think there's two answers to that. The first is, why does it take a commission? It's because there isn't a standing commission, a standing role in every jurisdiction that is responsible for shepherding policy development and critiquing its implementation. And often policy development in this area has been within existing emergency management bodies, but they can't do it for half of the year because they're busy doing their core work. So policy development really comes and goes, and there needs to be a much more concrete, ongoing commitment to policy review and development. And whilst Royal Commissions, people have short attention spans, there's lots happening, there's lots of hard things. It's a way of focusing everyone's energy and attention, but of course, going forward is an unrealistic approach to responding to disasters in Australia because they're going to be so frequent. We're going to be in a persisting state unless there are substantial changes in our world.
Thank you, Dominique. So please join me in thanking Dominique, and good luck in your work in Canberra today, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Okay, we're going to move into our community-led recovery session now. So I'm going to bring Margaret Moreton up on stage, who's the chair of this next session. So please join me in welcoming Margaret.
Good morning, everybody. Before I do anything, I haven't been here until this morning, so I would just like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which I'm standing. I arrived late yesterday from New South Wales, so it's my first chance to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and thank them for their ongoing care for land and water as the oldest living culture in the world. So how great to be here in person. Since the AFAC and ARDC conferences a little while ago, I'm still not quite used to seeing people in the room. And so, I keep grinning at everybody saying how great it is to see you all again. It's been too long. We don't have a lot of time to cover a very, very important topic, so I must not burble on in pleasure. We are looking at the issue of community resilience and in particular community-led recovery. And we're starting this morning's session with a keynote from Brendan Moon, and I'll introduce him very briefly. And then we have a panel session with 6, as you can count the chairs, 6 panelists, all of whom are doing fantastic work in this area. So we're going to be short and sharp. If you'd like to know more about any of the panelists, including Brendan, please Google. That's what it's created for, and you'll find out all sorts of things about what these people have been doing. But in brief, Brendan is the newly arrived, I don't know what day he's on, but newly arrived Coordinator General, mental block, for the newly created Emergency Management Agency federally. So it's absolutely wonderful to have Brendan here, 10 years in QRA and a whole bunch of other stuff that you'll find when you Google. So please welcome Brendan, and then we'll have a panel after Brendan speaks.
Good morning, and thank you very much, Margaret. I too would also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands on which we meet, the Yaga and the Turrbal people, and acknowledge their leaders past, present and emerging, and pay my respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders here who join us today and also online. Look, it's an absolute pleasure to be addressing the Natural Hazards Research Forum here today. And thank you, Andrew, for that opportunity. My role here today is very much about provoking a conversation about community-led recovery and the importance it has to the resilience of Australian communities and the core functioning of the way we live and operate throughout Australia. And I think it can be a very, very emotive subject because everyone has a view on what community recovery actually is. And I think today we have an extraordinarily diverse, experienced panel who have much experience, many personal experiences that they will share with us today about what community-led recovery is to them and what we actually need to sustain it into the future. And the real challenge here when we talk about community-led recovery is to really understand we're a diverse mob here in Australia. Rural, remote, First Nations, coastal, metropolitan communities who have different challenges facing them, different underlying stresses throughout their basic functioning, their ordinary functioning of everyday life for them. And then when we superimpose a natural disaster or some other emergency on top of them, then that's the importance of understanding what community-led recovery means for them and what we need to do to sustain them. As Margaret touched on, this is my first week as Coordinator General of the National Emergency Management Agency, the first time, and as Dominique touched on earlier, a key outcome of the Royal Commission. It's my first week as a Commonwealth public servant, and I don't know, I better be very careful given I'm back in Queensland as a newly minted Canberran, so please forgive me. But my role here today is to actually provoke a number of key, I suppose, concepts that I think we as a research forum should start to find and examine where we fit into this particular conversation. Why was the National Emergency Management Agency established? It was essentially internationally, governments are recognising that there is an increasingly complex and competing cascading crises that are impacting the ordinary functioning of our communities. And we've seen it's our own lived experience. Health, natural disasters over the last decade. And also we're looking at the emerging geopolitical tensions. And throughout many, many countries throughout the world, they have all established an agency to start to deal with those nationally significant issues that arise from those crises. Here at home, you would be asking, where do we fit in? We recognise states and local governments have that primary responsibility for leading all matters emergency management. But such is the breadth and the scale of some of the crises that are confronting us at this particular point in time, is that it bears, or there is great benefit in starting to bring the powers and the strengths and the capabilities that the Commonwealth have in this space to support local communities, state governments and others in this particular space to manage those disasters. I don't think anyone would be surprised by this. This has been our experience in the last 12 months. 36 major disaster events and incidents that have occurred between June of last year and June of this year. I think in Queensland, you would know the narrative. 75 of the 77 councils are in recovery at this particular point in time. In New South Wales, all bar 2 of the 128 council areas in New South Wales are in recovery as a result of just the events of the past year. And it is apparent that the consecutive, the complex and the compounding effects of these disasters have the potential to have system-wide impacts and consequences as a nation. And we're seeing this unfolding over the last week. And I've been on the ground in New South Wales on Wednesday of this week in Dubbo, Gunnedah and also in Tamworth, getting a sense of what this week means to communities that have been flooded 5 times already this year. And then prior to that, 4 or 5 times in the preceding 3 years. You can look at the numbers and you can look at the scale and the breadth of this, but when you actually speak to local communities and understand some of the impacts of some of the other challenges they face. In Gunnedah, for example, speaking to a couple of cowcockies on the ground there, COVID, the bushfires, a mice plague, locusts. That's even before the flooding, and they've had 9 floods on their particular properties. So when we're starting to talk about what does community-led recovery look like, there's some of the impacts and some of the consequences that we, from a system perspective, need to understand. That's just a bit of a sense spatially of where we're at. Now, they are extraordinary assistance measures that have been provided to those communities. So that's just out of the ordinary repairing of roads, repairing of essential public infrastructure. That's actually support to individuals, that is support to businesses, that's support to community groups. So you can see the scale of what we are facing at this particular point in time. So we are faced with three challenges in my view. We've always said we need a scalable model to be able to prepare, to respond and recover, and also deal with disaster risk across Australia. It needs to be able to handle any size crisis in any timescale across any geographic area. And our systems should be calibrated accordingly. But the reality is the equity and the accessibility to those basic functions is certainly not equal across Australia. And we need to get ourselves into that space so that we have that capability. And certainly NEMA has a role there, but it is not the complete role. This involves everyone. And when I say everyone, we have a firm belief that if we are going to build system resilience, then it needs to start at the household all the way through to the highest levels of government, and in actual fact include an international capability as well. And sometimes we speak to people in the emergency services who identify as the first responders, when in actual fact our first responders are those households and those communities. And that's part of the narrative that we need to include in the conversation. The second challenge that I'd like to throw out there, and I'm inordinately sensitive that people are in various stages of recovery at this particular point in time. And it goes to the point of what we are here to discuss today and challenge us as a group of research professionals about what some of the solutions are and where you are placed in the conversation. Is community-led recovery a myth in terms of what we are facing into the future? We all know we get the best outcomes when it is community-led, when it is coordinated at a state level and enabled at a Commonwealth level. That's policy, that's funding, that's actual support. But we recognise, given the intensity of these disasters, the frequency and the overlapping nature of these disasters, we recognise a community's ability to respond and recover from these events is becoming increasingly challenged. So the values, what's important for recovery, what should be prioritised, can be quite different immediately after a disaster, or if a community are recovering from multiple disasters, versus what the real long-term outcomes might and could be. And I was mindful of Dominique's earlier comments about all those recommendations from Royal Commissions. And I was at a meeting yesterday of all the emergency management commissioners from Australia. And someone said that there were some 2,700 recommendations that had been made in the last little while from a various number of reviews. Well, I think what we should be about is starting to paint the picture of the future to try and get in front of that. Because at this particular point in time, it is very much a reactive stance. And I think we have an opportunity, and you're an integral part of that conversation, to start to define and describe that future for us so that we can get in front of the issues now. Rather than being reactive, we can become somewhat more proactive. The third challenge is we recognise that we shortchange our communities if at every stage in recovery, we don't deal with disaster risk and build community resilience. And I will be the first to say that it is just not about resilient infrastructure. This is about, if we're talking about community recovery, this is about enabling our first responders. This is about enabling those community groups to start to lead that conversation before an event rather than after, because that's when we get the true best outcomes. And it's our role at state level, at local level, and at a national level to facilitate that capacity if we seek to build a system that can start to deal with the future that is in front of us. It's my experience over the last 10 years when I start to talk about community recovery, some of the things that have stood out for us that has underpinned recovery from many of the Queensland communities, and in fact, not only here in Australia, but certainly internationally as well. And that's the whole notion of champions, connections, and also collaboration. It requires champions not only at the most senior levels, and you see them every day in uniforms, in the immediate response phase, and then you see them immediately after disasters, but it's about facilitating and supporting those champions to actually carry the mantle for locally led recovery, but also building resilience at that local level. And I'm mindful of the work that the many mayors here in Queensland have done over the last certainly dozen years that I've been involved in this space. They are champions for their community, and that close connection that local government have played over the years here, and the system that has been built here has been an outstanding example of the champions within that community. But when you dig down into those communities and you look at some of the work of some of those community organisations, Country Women's Association, just to name one, many of those institutions, all they need is that additional support, guidance to be able to really deliver outstanding results for us. Connections are inordinately important as well. That's not just connections at the local level, but that's connections all the way through the chain. How do we shorten that distance between what's going on the ground and the decision makers and the policy and the funding settings that can support the priorities for those communities, not only in response, recovery, but also in dealing with disaster risk into the future. And we see this across the land is that, and once again, it's where do you find yourself in this conversation? If I look at that, one of those many regional resilience strategy engagement that we did across Queensland as a result of when we were building the strategy for disaster resilience, I'd ask the question, we saw there landowners, local groups, emergency managers, local governments, engineers. Where was the scientific community in that conversation, starting to inform what our future looks like? And here's the real opportunity, is to get involved in some of those conversations. And finally, it is about collaboration. We have many examples of communities highlighting key priorities for them to support their recovery. And it's about then aligning all the agencies that can support that. And that's all about those connections and then being able to collaborate to deal with solutions that actually support community recovery. So they're the three challenges I would throw to all of us here today. And it's being part of that conversation. But I think when you leave here, the important part or the important message that I have for the Natural Hazards Research Group is to be a part of that conversation, but also start to paint the picture for us so we can get in front of the wave. And certainly there is a massive appetite at all levels of government, at the most senior levels of government, to support that vision and to support how we're going to deal with our future. Thank you.
Thank you, Brendan. A great deal to think about in that keynote. I think the maps you put up, Brendan, if I could ask the other panel members just to help yourselves and find a seat up here. The map that you put up a few moments ago is going to change in the next week, I suspect, and a great deal of Victoria, where I was born and now reside, and Tasmania and parts of New South Wales are going to look slightly more orange and red. It does continue. So I have a few reactions to Brendan's keynote. I think we do have great challenges facing us. And for those of you who don't know me very well, I'm also in my first couple of weeks at the Institute for Disaster Resilience, and I'm absolutely delighted to be in that role now. I'm building on the work, as will Brendan be, as will Andrew is in the Natural Hazards organisation. We're all building on the work of people that have gone before us, and we all bring new perspectives. And my background includes working with government at all levels, non-government, I ran a small business in disaster resilience. I've worked with corporates and more recently in philanthropy. And what I'm learning is that there are people in all of those places trying to grapple with some of the challenges that Brendan has put on the table. And if we don't coordinate and collaborate and share with one another, then we run a risk of pulling in different directions, which won't help. So we have a huge task ahead of us to build those connections and bring people together to answer some of the questions that Brendan has thrown out. Now, I'm not going to take specific questions for Brendan right now. We're just going to ask everyone to sit in that place of not being able to ask just yet. I encourage anyone who would like to ask a question of either Brendan or anyone else in the panel, keep those Slido questions happening, pop them in. I understand you all know how to do that. We'll take questions at the end. I would like to very briefly, again, remember Google, wonderful resource. I would like to briefly introduce the other panelists, and then we're just going to launch in. So maybe the panelists can just do that when I say their name. So first of all, I'd like to introduce Elly Bird, for those of you who don't know her from Lismore. Elly has lived through many floods in Lismore over the past few years, and a lot of what Brendan said will resonate, I'm sure. Somewhere here is Professor Lisa Gibbs. Lisa's been doing fantastic work. If you're not familiar with her research, read it. There's some terrific work following the Black Saturday fires. She's from the University of Melbourne. Briony is leading Fire to Flourish, a wonderful initiative working in affected communities, helping the recovery process there, and based in Monash University. Michelle is from the Centre for Disability Research and Policy at the University of Sydney, and Kylie is the Chief Operating Officer at the Insurance Council of Australia. And I've just realised, Brendan, that you're outnumbered. We'll be gentle. So, keeping in mind that Brendan has, I'm going to stand right here because there's too many people and not enough microphones. So we'll try and make this as conversational as we can. Often when I moderate panels like this, I say Elly or whoever is being Elly, the community person, to the end, and we've decided to reverse all of that. We're going to start with a community-led answer. So Elly, you're probably still processing the things that Brendan said, but I would like to ask you, what do you think the essential, you might want to comment on whether community-led recovery is valid. And if so, what do you think the essential elements of community-led recovery or even community-led resilience actually are? We'll just check that all ourselves.
Helps if my microphone works. Although I do have a big voice, which is one of the reasons I get to be the person that sits on these panels and do the job of attempting to speak on behalf of people in my community. So thank you, Brendan, for your presentation. There's definitely a lot of things in there that resonate very strongly for me. And I'll also preface anything I'm going to say by saying, look, I am in the depths of probably one of the most significant community recovery experiences Australia maybe has ever seen. Just to set that context, I heard someone referring to it the other day as potentially the largest near-death experience for a community in Australia ever, potentially. Thousands of people experiencing near-death experiences. So that really sets the context for the community development work that I'm attempting to lead and deliver in my community. I also am very compassionate towards professionals in the recovery space that are attempting to work in recovery in our community. We have so many compounding factors that are making that incredibly difficult. Workforce shortages, not the least of those. So within the community, we are having so much trouble attracting good people into positions that are available in the recovery. So if you want a job, come to the Northern Rivers. We probably don't have anywhere for you to live. But if you're happy in a camper van and you're willing to get in amongst it with us, then please do come, because we have so many positions available. And that's one of the things that is hampering our ability to effectively recover and respond in a timely way. So with that context, I started thinking about what I needed to say about what I think the necessary things for good community-led recovery are. And it's quite hard to do so because I think for me, they're missing. So fundamentally, from my position as a community leader, the community engagement processes currently in the Northern Rivers are abysmal. I think that's partially because we have just been in limbo, waiting to know what's going to happen in our community, while other levels of government grapple with the incredibly complex problem that we have. So yeah, it's missing, it's inadequate. The community are ropeable that they're not being included or spoken to. There are no community advisory groups. There are no places where community voices can be heard and listened to, which is what we say the fundamental thing of community-led recovery is to amplify, listen and respect community voices in the processes. I'm very hopeful that as the Northern Rivers Reconstruction Corporation stands up, that they will do that. And I know individuals in that organisation have expressed that intention to me, but I still fear that it will be one way. It will be government to community. It will be, this is what we intend to do to you as a community. And what do you think about that? So community engagement. Meaningful community engagement and inclusion. The other thing that's incredibly frustrating is there's multiple levels of recovery communities currently, and there's no community voices on those. I'm on there because I pushed my way on, because in 2017, I gave up on the process and went, this is all too hard. And this time I said, no way, somebody needs to be in there talking to the needs of the community. And so now it's me. I don't represent the entire community, and I sit on multiple committees and I'm exhausted by the experience. So more pathways, more opportunities, more community leaders included in those structures. The third point I'll make, because I'm conscious that I could talk for the entire panel for the entire time, is this concept of community development, rapid response support community development. So when I was looking at the national principles for recovery this morning, the last one on there, and I went, yeah, there's none of that happening, is recognise and support capacity. So let's focus on capacity building for communities when they're in this response. And again, that's something that I have been asking for since pretty much day one, or actually realistically probably about week 3. By the time I had time to do it, which is capacity building. It's like organisations like mine, like Resilient Lismore, or like Wardell Core, or like Korakai Hub, or like Koori Mail, shout out to the Koori Mail, capacity building, quick response funding, capacity building support to help us do the critical work that we know how to do and want to continue to do. So many community initiatives start to fall over because they have no money, they have no capacity, they run out of time, they run out of energy. I said yesterday, and I think it's worth repeating, I have seen probably at least 25 incredible, skilled community engagement professionals leave our initiative because I had no way of retaining them. That's an incredible loss to our recovery because it's taken 8 months for the government response to stand up, whereas the community response has been running this entire time. I think that's probably enough.
Elly's quite right. She could talk to you for the next 2 hours. And every time I see Elly, hear Elly, I'm in awe of Elly and the many people like her scattered around communities fighting the good fight and being pushy and exhausted. And if I had a hat, I'd take it off to you, Elly. The good news is Brendan was taking notes. Okay, so moving to Lisa. So Lisa, you've done a lot of work with communities recovering after very large events. And so I'm interested in your reflections on this whole question of community-led recovery or resilience, and particularly now that you've managed to hear from both Brendan and Elly. What do you add to this?
Thanks, Margaret. And thanks, Elly, for just so eloquently describing how hard community-led recovery is in reality. We all think it's a fantastic notion, but in practice, it's really difficult. And whenever I think or talk about community-led recovery, I think about one of the communities we worked with on the Beyond Bushfires study. And it was one of those that was completely wiped out by the Black Saturday bushfires. And I know the people in state government supporting recovery were really committed to having community voice in the decisions about how to rebuild that community. And they organised community meetings, they had architects there. So when people talked about what they wanted the buildings and the streetscape to look like, these architects did these quick sketches, put them up on screen so people could visualise them, talk about them, vote on them. Fantastic process. And then years later, when I'm interviewing people in the community about how they're going and these buildings and the streetscape is now in place, I was really surprised to hear people saying how unhappy they were with how their town looked. And I said to one of the participants, can you just talk me through it? Because I thought they went really carefully with that to make sure it was reflecting what community wanted. And she said, oh yeah, we had those public meetings, but they just listened to the feedback that matched their vision for what should happen. She said, for me, it was like they said, we're going to buy you a brand new car and you can tell me what colour you want. And I said, no, I just need it for bouncing around the back paddock. So I'd just really like another, just a secondhand ute would be great, thanks. And they've gone, no, we've got a Ferrari. Would you like red? And that's what she said it felt like. They had this beautiful new town, but it didn't feel like their town. And that really struck home for me. And so when we're, as researchers, trying to support community-led processes, I try and be guided by the principles of deliberative democracy. I always forget the order, but essentially they're influence, inclusiveness, and deliberation. So with influence, it's really making sure that the process genuinely has an influence on the outcomes. And as external agencies, that can be really tricky because every community is different and has support needs as well. So you've got to balance the level of support you provide and the level of agency that is available. And so one of the things that we've been funded by NHRA to do is to work with community recovery committees. And Kate Brady is leading this process where she's trialling this tool where these recovery committees can do a kind of a self-assessment to say, well, this is how we came together. This is the scope of our contribution. This is how we're going to govern and how we're going to reach decisions when there's conflicting ideas. This is where our expertise lies and this is where we need support. And so it provides clarity around how the committee is operating for them and for the external agencies coming in. So that's something that we're working on. And Colin Gallagher, part of our team, who's a network analyst, is also going to work with those committees about, well, who are each of you connected to in the community? So that there's a sense of, well, who does this committee actually represent? And this is a really important part of inclusiveness, isn't it? And Elly was telling me last night that, the community recovery committees in Victoria are all well and good, but they don't even have those. They don't tend to stand those up in other states. And that's where the role of community groups is really vital because they're connected to each other, they're tapped into what's needed, a great way to reach multiple people. But of course, who's not part of those community groups? And how many towns have you been in where the same office bearers run all the groups? And so the sense of, oh, well, we've connected with 5 different groups in the community, they're probably the same people. So one of the things, NHRA have offered a PhD scholarship to Phoebe Quinn. Phoebe, are you here? Wave? Can't see. Anyway, she's here today. She's looking at trialling this fantastic tool for drawing contributions from people right across the community on contentious issues in quite a gentle way that breaks down the elements of a thorny issue so that you can say, okay, we might disagree on these elements, but we actually do agree on these ones, and that's providing a path forward. So that's a really important effort to support inclusiveness that will be tricky, but we're working on it. And the final element is deliberation. And this was, I think, is probably the space where researchers have the most important role, because we don't want people making decisions when they don't have all the information they need. And often there's misinformation. And so what we'd like to be able to do is to provide a sort of a summary of the evidence that says, okay, well, this is what you need to know about what we've worked out already. We don't know how it applies in your context, but at least you have some confidence about what the evidence is. And that's, I've got a prop, if you have bionic eyesight. This is one of our resources called the Guide to Disaster Recovery Capitals. And it's just super accessible, just says, you know what, if you're talking about social capital, this is what we know. So you might want to think about and discuss this. This is what we know about natural capital, financial, political, and so on. And so, Elly, you said yesterday you wish there was evidence about the importance of community groups, just any community groups, to contribute to disaster resilience. Well, this is my gift to you. And really, that's the point. It's not just to kind of go, these are things you might want to talk about, but here's a little grab you can put in your funding application, backed up by published research. So we've all got to work together on this. We're sort of being guided by influence, inclusiveness, deliberation, but it's really just trying to have some framework to move forward. Thank you.
Thanks, Lisa. So that was a nice moment. I'll keep moving because we do need to get through everyone, but there's so much to talk about. I do encourage you to put your questions in Slido if you want to have pose questions to particular speakers. So the next person I'd like to introduce is Briony. Now, Briony, you've been working through Fire to Flourish with communities affected by the summer fires. What are you learning that's either different or similar to the themes that are now emerging about community-led recovery?
Yeah, thanks, Margaret, and thanks to the other speakers so far. So the communities we're working with in Fire to Flourish were affected by fires 2.5 years ago, and we've spent the last 12 months really having the privilege of deeply listening and hearing their stories, their experiences during the immediate aftermath of the fire, and then watching how their experiences evolve, as it gets, longer into their recovery period. And what's really clear is that bushfires was a disruptor that happened 2.5 years ago, and that disruptor happened in the backdrop of a long history of the community, and they've got a long future ahead that they're thinking about. And one of our funders, the Paul Ramsay Foundation's mission is around disrupting cycles of disadvantage. And so we're particularly seeking to work with people and with communities that are experiencing deeply rooted systemic inequities that haven't had the opportunity to be at the table through a lot of the recovery processes so far, that have been experiencing the intergenerational trauma that comes with colonisation. And so watching and listening and supporting their experiences and journey through that has been, I guess, highlighting that the disaster happens, but like you were saying, Brendan, and like we all know, there's going to be more disasters. How can this recovery process actually be an opportunity to reset some of those system conditions that are locking in those systemic inequities? Can that recovery process actually be the window of opportunity for the community to come together and set foundations for long-term thriving and flourishing? We hope it can, we think it can, but the only way it can is if that pathway is self-determined. And what's been really interesting is hearing some of the stories, the trauma that still sits with many of the communities is actually not the bushfire itself, it's the way they experienced the response and the recovery afterwards. The key hazard for some of the community members, particularly the First Nations communities, was the explicit racism that they experienced, the dislocation from their country during the evacuation. And absolutely, there's things that need to happen in a crisis, but when those emergency management responses happen without a backdrop and without a foundation of trust and without a foundation of relationship, then the damage that does, the re-triggering and the re-traumatizing for community members is really deep. And that's part of what they're still continuing to work through now. And so is community-led recovery realistic? I think it's the only way can be, but how does it need to be supported? What do people need to do differently to make community-led recovery happen in practice? There needs, our community members are the absolute margins, their bandwidth 2.5 years later, they're exhausted, they're fatigued, they have very little further they can give without funding support because they've got their day jobs, they've got all the other things that are happening on in their community and in their lives. And so we need to find mechanisms to inject funding to support that ongoing recovery work, but also the community development work, because we know the evidence is so clear how important that social capital is, that the connections across the community, the capabilities that the community have, the leadership, the distributed leadership, so that it's not just the usual suspects that are standing up, but all parts of the community have voice and have leadership and have a role and agency in supporting their community. But that takes investment. It takes people on the ground doing the hard yards, going out, bringing people together. And so what are the mechanisms and the ways that we can inject funding to support that ongoing community development work? And then how do we build in formal mechanisms for power and agency of community at all layers of government, at all layers of decision making? Listening to community voice is one thing, but community power is another. And so how do we start to embed that community power and representation and agency across all spheres, so that the direction and the priorities and the needs and the aspirations, that's what's leading the recovery. It's absolutely supported. It's not community on their own, but it's led by the vision of the community. And I think what we need to recognise that this is radical system change. This is not just incremental shifts. It's a complete flipping of the hierarchy that we operate by, from a top-down power-based hierarchy to a bottom-up trust-based hierarchy. And there's roles for local, state and federal government, really critical roles, but putting community at the centre of that and in the lead of that, and trust between people in those roles, in those agencies, so that the relationships provide that foundation is critical. And so how do we very intentionally lead into that system change agenda? We know that little projects here and there don't change systems. The way that we change systems is the processes we wrap around that, the processes of relationship building, the processes of learning. This is new stuff, but we need to learn quickly. We've got to accelerate this transformational change. And so what is our vision of the system in the future? We know it's not what we experience and what we see now. Picking up your challenge to us, Brendan, can we envision what our system needs to look like? What are the practices we want to be seeing on the ground? And how do we start to build up the knowledge base, the experimentation, and develop the tools, like you were saying, Lisa, develop the tools and the solutions, but very rapidly learn and connect and share, so that we're collectively building the resource, the knowledge and the toolkit to do that radical system change.
And now I'm taking notes. Because there are key themes happening here, and I think that it's a really wonderful opportunity to have NEMA, AIDR and natural hazards all in the one room, thinking about how can we support community leadership more effectively? How can we ask the questions and find out what we need to learn and know? The number of times I've been in meetings where we all say the first layer of what needs to be done and everybody in the room agrees, and then we might discover to our horror, shame, surprise, that what we're doing might not actually be working toward the outcomes that we think we're after. So the whole idea of envisaging the future, what are we trying to... Anyway, I'm madly taking notes because this panel's just so informed and experienced about all of these questions. So before we get distracted though by what I'm learning, next speaker, I'd like to introduce Michelle again. So there's been a bit of a theme so far, Michelle. I'm sure you're paying great attention to the inclusion question and whose voice is in the room and whose voice is not in the room. So given your work, I'd love to have your perspective on that aspect of what we're discussing.
Yeah, thank you, Margaret. And oh my goodness, I'm so humbled to be in this room and on this panel. I feel like the conversation is sort of building in this generative direction. So thank you to the people who spoke before me. Can I first start by saying I bring with me today the perspectives and voices of a wide range of people across Australia now. We are a growing group of people who are championing disability inclusive disaster risk reduction. And that's expanding to aged care inclusion and homelessness inclusion and child inclusion and youth inclusion and mental health inclusion. And it's very exciting momentum that's being built. So I bring that with me today, and I bring that representative voice with me today. But can I also say that I will bring these discussions right back to all of those people in the community, because that's how we work to make sure the voices are included and to make sure that nodes of communication and that distribution happens throughout communities and across Australia. In 2015, when we started doing disability inclusive disaster risk reduction here in Australia, that we didn't have a vocabulary for it. In fact, people stumbled quite a lot over this AIDR acronym that we were introducing into the lexicon here in Australia. We had 4 principles: accessibility, participation, collaboration, and non-discrimination, but we had no tools to put any of those principles into action. And so we started by bringing stakeholders together, and our program of research works on this simple premise. You bring people with disability, the services and the individuals that support them together with emergency personnel and government at the most local level of community, and you start a conversation. And that's how it works. We began doing that in 2015 in 3 communities across New South Wales. And we produced at the end of that some actionable nuggets, if you will, in our local emergency management guidelines for how do you do DIDRR in New South Wales at the local government level. And we created a problem, as researchers tend to do. We had more questions without answers to them. And we made a specific recommendation at that time that said, government and emergency service agencies need tools that help people with disability to tailor preparedness to their support needs and their situation. And the problem was those tools did not exist. So we boldly put the recommendation forward and then sought an additional project and wider collaborations, and what has become quite a magnificent journey of person-centered emergency preparedness and embedding that into the practices of local governments, of individuals, of the services that support them. I'm really proud to say that, on December 3rd, 2021, Minister Shorten announced Australia's new disability strategy. It includes, for the first time, disability inclusive emergency planning and targeted actions on person-centered emergency preparedness. Around that same time, the National Disability Insurance Scheme Quality and Safeguarding Commission launched their legislative amendment that requires people who receive supports through the NDIS, whether that's a registered or non-registered provider, to have person-centered and supported service continuity plans for the people that they support. It's great. We've gotten to that legislative change through that community-led, and I would like to say community-led preparedness and preparedness actions. And one of the things that has been fundamental about that is that we tried to disrupt what normally happens in the dialogue with emergency management and government engagement with communities around your risk and around your preparedness. And it's perpetuated, I suppose, at an international level, because the Sendai framework's requirement is, understand our risk. And so our emergency services and government help people understand the risk. And unfortunately, that's the wrong starting point. We actually need to start with people's capabilities and support needs and how they manage their everyday uncertainties as a starting point for their self-assessments. And our person-centered emergency preparedness capability wheel has 8 of those elements and organized probing questions to help people self-assess how they manage every day first. That begins a really productive conversation about how do I understand my local disaster risks? What does that actually mean for my personal support needs and my unique situation? And how am I then going to tailor that to the action plans I need to take to make sure I'm aware, ready, capable, and prepared for a disaster? But not only that, for people who are at greater risk, and make sure that those networked communications to the people around them that are actually going to be there to support them in an emergency know about their plan, are part of the plan, and can action that themselves. That has been a critical and fundamental disruptor in a very positive way, I'd like to think. And I'm really pleased to say that our emergency personnel and volunteers are really getting on side with this idea that person-centered emergency preparedness or people-centered disaster risk reduction doesn't mean our emergency personnel have to go door to door and prepare everyone. It really just means we have to change the conversation about how we do our engagement work and where we start our conversations when we do that community-led and group-based work with communities. We often think that when you do disability inclusive anything, it's about empowering people with disability. It's true. It is about empowering, putting the power, as Briony says, into the hands of people with disability and shifting that power. It's absolutely about that. But our work is showing that it's actually empowering our volunteers in the emergency service sector. It's empowering our community engagement providers, and it's empowering our personnel at the local council who are making their disability inclusion action plans to communicate with their local emergency management planning functions of council. It's empowering transformative change in how they work. And that's been very, very exciting part of the process. But we're not done. The panel has talked about what needs to happen next. And I think Elly was really clear on that. We need to build capacity in how to do this. We have great diffusion of PSEP at the local level, at the state level, and supported, but it's not throughout all of Australia. People are still learning about it. They're not quite aware of it yet, and we need to build that capability. But it needs to be led, supported, and coordinated through local governments and their interagency networks of support. And then that needs to be supported at all levels up to the Commonwealth. So I hope that gives a little bit of an overview of how we're making sure that voice is included, but also to recognize, and I often say this to my colleagues with disability, your voice is critical. You've been excluded from this conversation for far too long, and you are a really critical voice. Come to this conversation, but recognize you're not the only voice. The emergency services sector, when the rubber hits the road, has a massive responsibility in this space, and we need critical dialogue there. And I say to our services of all types and stripes that support people in their communities, they've been equally excluded from these conversations. And it's usually not until disaster and until the recovery moment that we see their resilience in full force, and then we wear them out. So what we're trying to do is really flip that paradigm and not wear them out, help them prepare, be aware, capable, prepared, and nurture that long before disaster strike. Thank you.
Thanks, Michelle. And even though clocks don't tick anymore, the clock is ticking. And so once again, I would encourage you, if you are not familiar with any of the research or the resources that each speaker is referring to, please chase them online and find them, because in each case they're outstanding. And that was a beautiful summary of the kind of system change that we need if we're to address the kind of challenges that Elly has so beautifully explained to us. So we need more and more system change. So with a system change view, if I could come to you, Kylie, thank you for your patience. It's always hard when you're last. Thank you for your patience. So from an insurance perspective, I'm interested in you adding to this conversation by talking about what the Insurance Council or what the insurance industry can add to this discussion about. And I think I'm moving now, I've been doing it for a while, but I think this is helping me, this panel, moving away from community-led recovery as language I'll use much. I think personally, I think it's about community-led preparedness and resilience, because recovery suggests that we do get to a place of stability again. It suggests that to me anyway, which I don't think is going to be the case. So, but anyway, over to insurance. What's the insurance ad here?
No, thank you, Margaret, and your comments then probably the light bulb moment I've been having listening to the conversation this morning as well. So to put this into context, and let's just talk about the events of the last couple of years. And thank you for that fabulous slide. I took a photo of it and I'm going to recreate it under my brand. We have declared 12 insurance catastrophes over the last 2 and a bit years. And to put the flooding event of February, March into perspective, it is now the second largest event in Australia's history. The largest event is actually the Sydney hailstorm. And we have insured losses of over $5.45 billion from that event alone. 234,000 claims, and very few local councils from just north of here to just south of Sydney, not affected. And I recognise, Elly, the impact on Lismore was extraordinary. The insurance sector has two responsibilities in the event of addressing preparedness and recovery in Australia. And the first is at a community level and the second is at the customer level. At a community level, our purpose is to be the voice for a resilient Australia. And we take that very seriously because, in fact, we have a voice with government, Brendan, my new best friend, to talk about the need to change how Australia thinks about severe weather, because we think about it through the lens of recovery. But actually, we need to start thinking about it through the lens of preparedness. The productivity review findings of a few years ago, 97% of government funding gets spent on recovery, 3% on preparedness. It's a really simple flip, and it's a flip that needs to happen. We need additional investment in resilience and mitigation. We need to have a serious conversation about what we build, where we build it, and how we build it. In this country today, we can build on floodplains. And if that is going to persist, then we need to have a conversation about what gets built and what infrastructure is in place to allow flood-effective distribution of water, not actually incurring greater outcomes or greater requirement for response because that infrastructure, in fact, destroyed flood-effective flow. And it's not just about floods, it's about cyclone, bushfire, earthquakes. I can't believe a decade on I'm talking about earthquakes again, but it's all natural or severe weather, climate change, severe weather events. So from our perspective, being a consistent voice to government, listening to local community to understand their needs from a resilience and mitigation perspective, and having that constant and persistent drumbeat around the need for further investment in resilience and mitigation. We are very much welcoming and happy to hear the Australian government's investment of $200 million in mitigation and resilience every year for the next 5 years. And we are very pleased to see the Queensland government's response through the Resilience Ready Fund. We're about to hear New South Wales's, and we need to see all state and territories coming out with their matched programs, not waiting for an event to happen to come out with that, but actually preparing for what that needs to look like. The second is customer. And at the end of the day, insurance is a commercial product. So it is a contract between a customer and their insurance company. And the role we play in recovery is as second responders. And it's to ensure that we can assist customers to recover, to get back into their homes or otherwise as quickly as possible. And look, I'll be the first to say that the floods in March and February this year have put that under strain. 234,000 claims is a lot of claims to get through. Our members have recruited thousands of new staff to assist in that process. But that's actually what we need to do. We need to be able to dial up and down as those requirements present themselves. But again, listening to customers, future product innovation, making sure we're on the ground. And probably what doesn't get seen from an insurance perspective is that we've got massive amounts of people who have been deployed to flood affected areas who literally leave their lives at home and move to or close to those communities to work in those communities full time through the assessment and rebuild process. That's an important part of being on the ground and being connected with those communities. So the customer is a very important voice for us. We utilise customer advocates, but we also utilise the customer themselves to do that. We do that informally, as I've just talked about, on the ground each day, but we've also done that through formalised mechanisms where we go into communities as often as is required to educate, provide information, listen and assist those customers with their recovery. And that education piece is really important. So from an insurance perspective, we are the nation's shock absorbers. We would like to see that community-led recovery becomes something that is automated and is diminished over time, because in fact, we've built prepared communities that have the right infrastructure, the right homes, the right community settings to actually respond before an event than having to recover after.
Thanks, Kylie. And I'm reminded of something that lots of us say to one another, that ultimately we're here to reduce harm and to keep people safe, of which you're describing an important part of that system. So I would like to leave time for a couple of questions. So I'm going to ask Brendan, having listened to all of that, do you have any reflections before we move to other questions about the questions you posed in the first place, about what you've heard and learned today, anything at all that's top of mind for you?
Well, I've been completely debunked in terms of my second challenge, haven't I? Because we've listened today to people who've been at the coalface of what community recovery is all about. And they've described to me sort of probably 5 key issues, if I can touch on those, and maybe sort of ask you, the members of the Natural Hazards Research of Australia group, to reflect on your role in this. Is that what we've heard today is that if we are going to confront the challenges that currently we are faced with at a national level, but also at a community level, in terms of some of those crises we're facing, we are going to have to take a systems approach. Everyone is in this together. It can't just fall to one element. And what you've heard today is a strong rebuttal of the notion that this is a myth. It is so important that the community do lead recovery, but they need to be enabled to do so. And that's one of the key messages I will continue to take away from this. We need to understand that it's not going to be effective if we don't understand the underpinning long-term stresses that exist in that community. So if we're going to deal with the emergency response and recovery, we've got to understand what's going on in that community and ensure that there is a strong approach to dealing with some of those stresses. That requires many, many agencies and many, many people being part of that conversation, including you. It has to be inclusive. We've heard about people-centred. We've heard about inclusion. We need to recognise, as I said initially, we're a diverse mob here in Australia, very, very decentralised. One size doesn't fit all in terms of our approach. So we need to be flexible. We need to understand. And I think lastly, and I go back to Elly's point, I think the qualities of the system revolve around, it is a people-centred system. We need to listen to those communities. We need to amplify their message to all decision makers and all of those who can provide capability, but it needs to be respected as well. And I think they're important qualities of the system that you've described today when it comes to community recovery.
Thanks, Brendan. And I'm thinking now about the kinds of research questions that we need answers to. We are talking a serious systems change here, I agree, and at all levels, from an individual in a household all the way up to a national approach at the highest level of government or business or insurance. So how we create a different future, what are all the elements of that system that needs to change? These are all questions burning a hole now for me. Now, we only have a few minutes, and I know that I'm standing in between all of you and morning tea, but I would love to just address a couple of questions. Why don't we just start at the top? No, I'm going to start because I don't want Brendan to be the next voice. I'm going to start at the second top and see if we can come back to Brendan. Community means many things. It's not always geographical or ethnic. So we may disagree about what communities is. I agree, who's in, who's out. How does this complicate community-led recovery, and how can we address that? So anyone in the panel like to tackle that? How do we address this question of what the heck is community anyway? We've been talking about that for years. Yeah, go for it.
I've just come back from spending some time with a community in Lockyer Valley. And we had a community level conversation over 2 days. We started with really talking about how people have been coping, not just with more recent floods, but over the past 10 years. They're still thinking about 2011. And how have people and organizations, what assets have you used? Have you mobilized? Have you gotten together? Who's been missing from the conversation? Over the course of these conversations and dialogue and people interviewing each other over the course of the day, the community put a challenge to themselves. And they said, I'm looking around the room and I can see a number of people who are missing. So how are we going to figure out who is our community? And how are we going to use our own personal connections, talking about social capital, to bring people to the table? The conversation then went something like this. Some people don't want to be in this room. Some people are not going to be comfortable to be in this room. So they put another challenge to themselves. How are we going to use and leverage the safety and the trust that we have with different people in our communities to help that flourish across the communities? So I'll just offer that as a bit of a sample of some of the conversations that are happening in communities about what does it actually mean to them in a practical way.
I think the community, we need to also be thinking about community as a system. So we've got our big systems, but the community itself is a system with all its different parts, its households, its different cohorts, its organisations, its formal institutions, and really leaning into that systems understanding, and for the community members themselves to be defining the system in a way that makes sense for them and thinking about who needs to be at the table through that, but also remembering that country is part of that system as well. And as I'm learning from my First Nations colleagues and friends, you know, we need to country needs to be at the centre of how we think about community, and it has agency in how we relate, and our relationship with country is central to a discussion around adapting to climate change, managing the land, being stewards of our ecosystems.
Thank you both. I'm going to beg your indulgence because we'll probably go just a couple of minutes into morning tea. I would like to ask Brendan the question, but I'm going to throw two questions combined. There are a couple of questions up here, Brendan, about the role and responsibility of both local government and state government. And do you see those roles diminishing or changing now that you're at the federal level, or how do you see that layer of government levels working?
I absolutely don't see the role of the state government nor of local government diminishing here. I think all levels of government have a massive and significant contribution to make to the challenge that we are currently dealing with. If you look at the way it operates, if you want to get close to your community, you've got to go through the various layers of government and looking at what those, you know, sort of what are the mechanisms that actually support the functioning of those communities. So there's no way in the world that we can diminish the role of either, because they all play a significant part of this. But if I look across all of the plans that exist in the disaster management space and in very, very many other spaces that we operate in, what I see and what I hear regularly from the community, it's all got to be integrated. We all need to be working closely together. Reduce that distance between the household and the key decision makers. That's a challenge for us, and that involves all levels of government. One of the things that strikes me, and this will be sort of something that we seek to get our teeth into, is if we look at our planning for recovery here in Australia, we do not have a recovery plan that clearly articulates the roles of the community, the household, local government, state government, and the Commonwealth government. If I look overseas, just across the ditch, they do. We have a recovery strategy here, and I think we've referred to it as today and some of the qualities we seek to see in effective recovery. But I think we need to have that plan so that we can have the conversation with the community about what their role is, and then at the various levels of government and also the private sector. We can't let them off the hook here either about what their roles are and what they bring to the table. And I think that way we'll be much more effective in dealing with some of the issues that we are now confronting.
I could just add to that, because I think that's exactly spot on. There's no diminishing of role here. There is an integration of role through that pipeline. But there's some of the most important tools that we need are lacking at the moment, and that's around data and publicly available information, and about disclosure, because the best way to mitigate a problem is actually to be informed about that problem in the first instance. So how do we actually empower individuals, homeowners, communities, governments at all levels, and the private sector to share, disclose and build the information base that Australia needs to make good decisions around resilience?
There's much to be done. I'm very conscious of time, and I could stand here and ask more questions and we could have a fabulous time, but I won't. Look, if I could offer an idea as well, I think we need to spend some time as a collective community somehow getting clear about the future we're trying to create, and see if there are faster ways to get there, see if there are elements of the system that we really need to address if we're going to get that future closer to us, because the present is pretty tumultuous and keeps doing that, and that's not going to change. So look, please join me in thanking all of the panel members, Brendan, Kylie, Elly, Lisa, Briony and Michelle. It's been fabulous. Thank you very much. And now I think morning tea's outside. I encourage you to keep this conversation going amongst yourselves, but also feel free to tackle, not literally, the panel members and have the conversation with us as well. Thanks very much.
Okay, we'll get the session started. Thank you. So if people could please be seated, that would be great. Thank you very much. My name is Deb Bunker and I am the newly appointed Chief Science Officer for Natural Hazards Research Australia. And I would like to welcome you all here this morning to this session on managing disaster risk and building disaster resilience. I would also like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of this land, the Turrbal and Yagara peoples, pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging, and extend that respect to any First Nations people here today. I recognise the lands and water of the Meanjin have always been places of teaching, research and learning, and we will continue that process with our keynote speakers today. We have a speaker, Professor Lauren Rickards, who's talking to us on climate scenarios and plausible futures. To start with, Lauren is a human geographer and ecologist at RMIT University, working primarily on climate change futures and related questions about urban, rural and human nature relationships. So this is very key to much of what we do. With degrees from the University of Oxford and Melbourne and experience in the private sector, Lauren conducts research on many of the social dimensions of climate change. Lauren advises a wide range of groups in government, business and the NGO sector on climate change issues and is a lead author with the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. So welcome, Lauren.
Thanks so much, Deb, and thank you to the NHRA for the opportunity to be here. I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the unceded lands on which we're meeting and on which I conduct my research, and to also extend my respects to elders past, present and future. So as Deb indicated, I'm speaking here as an IPCC author, particularly with the recent report on impacts, adaptation and vulnerability, which I'll touch on in a moment. And also as a researcher who's done work with the Bushfires Natural Hazards, CRC, and now the NHRA. And I was asked to speak about climate futures, which has clearly been an implicit and often explicit theme in the past few days. And so let me begin by working out how to change my slides. Let me begin by talking about directly to this question, but I want to particularly emphasise climate change futures for reasons I'll go into. And I want to draw out two particular challenges, which I think are highly relevant to this group. This is around impacts propagating and also the implications of that for enablers, those of us in institutions and organisations to which others are turning in this time of climate change, and think about this question of research needs and opportunities. So, of course, when we think about climate change, we are talking about the present. This isn't actually a future risk anymore. It is a manifesting issue right here, right now. And everybody who's been following the news just over the last 24 hours will realise this is very much part and parcel of what we have to deal with now. At the same time, we also really need to adopt a bifocal lens. We need to have that close-up ability to interrogate the present, but we also need an increasing ability to look into the future. And these are the sorts of images that we get frequently presented with as depictions of the future. They're ones that can be awkward to kind of imagine ourselves into, and yet they do point to some very, very particular things. Let me draw out just a couple. First of all is, of course, the upkick in the curves. So when we think about particular scenarios, now called SSPs in IPCC lexicon, which is a kind of arcane and bureaucratic way of discussing things, is very technical, but basically these are different scenarios of how the future may play out. It's those upkicking curves at the top there that, of course, are particularly concerning. Whether or not we follow that trajectory into the future depends on many things. Some of the key uncertainties are the degree to which the climate is sensitive to greenhouse gases. That's actually a really, really active area of research. And unfortunately, we're finding that the climate tends to be more sensitive, that is, react more strongly to greenhouse gases than previously considered. At the same time, there's great uncertainty, very, very important uncertainty around anthropogenic emissions, which is to say how we're responding with our mitigation. And you can see there the kind of gaps between what's pledged at the moment and what we need to achieve to reduce climate change, average global warming to 1.5 or 2 degrees. And of course, there's also other uncertainties, including what's called carbon cycle feedbacks, which is where climate change impacts are affecting natural systems, causing the release of long stored greenhouse gases, notably carbon dioxide and methane. So when we put all that together, we have a huge bundle of uncertainty, but in actual fact, the main uncertainty, the biggest uncertainty we face is around impacts. And that feeds on to mitigation, it feeds onto that anthropogenic emissions question, because the more we're impacted, the less able we are to do the work of decarbonisation, the less able we are to actually do the work of adaptation. There's a real cycle here we need to address. And so thinking about the sort of reports that are being put out, this is the one I was involved in. And you can see here the real emphasis on multiplicity, on complexity, on the fact that we're actually looking at things that are becoming more difficult to manage, compounding across space and through systems. And that, as they say here, are generating new sources of vulnerability, which is what I'm particularly concerned about. And if we consider that, so that was the global situation, if we bring that back to the Australian scale, here's a little bit of a summary that my co-authors and I put together in the conversation, that knowledge translation vehicle we all turn to, which really just emphasises that these things are very much playing out in the Australia and New Zealand situation. And it's this pressure that, as you see there, the greater pressure on our ability to respond, which I think is particularly important for us here to consider, and particularly to consider on our position within that ability to respond. And so the work of adaptation has begun as we conclude, but we found that progress is uneven and insufficient given the risks we face. So I'm sure many of you are absolutely familiar with sort of the conceptual framework underneath the idea of climate change impacts. Alan Marsh presented a nice version yesterday. I have my own mathematical interpretation of it. We'll have to compare addition and multiplication, Alan, and subtraction and division. But basically, these things are all interconnected. That's what we're all trying to represent here. So this is a sort of depiction of the sort of propeller diagram, which is a kind of extended Venn diagram sometimes the IPCC uses. But what it's trying to emphasize is that it's not all about climate. So when we think about climate futures or climate change futures, we can't get too distracted by focusing just on the level of climatic change. In actual fact, there's a whole lot of things changing, in particular things like exposure patterns, and that's both spatial, but also exposure in terms of what systems we're positioned within, and non-climatic vulnerabilities. All those other things that mean that a given climatic hazard, a given threat is more or less consequential for you at that given time, given everything else that you're coping with. And COVID has been a really big kind of awareness raising event in that respect. And so the challenge here is to actually consider the way in which all of those things interact, multiply with each other, the ways in which the impacts that are occurring today are creating non-climatic vulnerabilities tomorrow. This is the spiral that we need to escape from. And so the challenge for adaptation is to outpace that proliferation of impacts and vulnerability. We need those bright green arrows to be larger than the dark green arrows. And I'm sorry, something happened with the colouring. It wasn't meant to be quite so subtle. So yeah, the impacts are causing vulnerabilities. They're also in some cases worsening exposures, even hazards, as we know in terms of compound hazards. And the task for adaptation is to outpace that. When we think about resilience, and we're here to talk about these questions of resilience, we're also familiar with these sorts of depictions. This is a common sort of graph, and this one was utilised in the IPCC chapter on health and health systems. And what it indicates is that, of course, there's a whole lot of work that needs to go into recovering to a normal level of functioning within a given sort of period of time, to get to just that sort of status back to where we would have called here running in place, so that we don't slip backwards. It's the slipping backwards which really creates those vulnerabilities which worsen impacts tomorrow. At the same time, we know that in a climate changing world, and we know how much hard work is involved in all of this, we need to not just recover, but we also need to fix the existing problems that are sort of causing that vulnerability, causing those drops in resilience, and we need to get ahead of future shocks. And so the adaptation challenge is like this on steroids, if you like. So what we're talking about is worsening and more frequent shocks, causing the idea of getting back to where we were to be increasingly difficult. And so what we have is an adaptation equation where we're talking about the extra hard work of recovering again and again, fixing more and more existing problems, and at the same time getting ahead of what are worse future shocks, and doing this in a good adaptation way, which is to avoid maladaptation, which is to say in a way that helps, not hinders others. So you can see the scope of the challenge we face. So when we think about all that and think about all those many factors, the interactions between vulnerabilities and impacts, you can see that in a sense what the climate does, at least over the next 1 to 2 decades, is almost less consequential, if you like, than what we're doing and how we're actually coping in a given moment. And so one of the conclusions that the IPCC draws out of this is that the emphasis really needs to be on these changes in vulnerability and exposure, which is to say that absolutely propagating impacts that are occurring here today and making sure that we get on top of them immediately. This is an ethos, if you like, a starting point that my colleague Adriana Keating, who's here, and I really took to a piece of work that we did with RIOS around scenarios in a climate change world for the emergency management sector. And thanks to anyone here who was involved
in that work and really kind of went on a bit of a journey, as you say, a bit of a journey with us and REOS about how to actually think through what emergency management sector and emergency services might look like in the future. And the emphasis really was on these non-climatic factors. So while we were looking at a climate change world, we're very much aware of all of these other considerations. So we looked at a range of drivers, the social, the technological, environmental, policy and political. These are drivers that NHRA research really helps to illuminate, such as the session yesterday on workforces. And it put these together with a whole range of other forms of intelligence to develop some scenarios which were distinguished along levels of top-down or bottom-up sort of governance and levels of social cohesion, which I won't go into, but they really just sort of depicted different contexts or different situations in which the emergency services might be working. Ones where, say, top-down technology and automated systems might be driving effects versus a bottom-up community-based approach. Ones where there may actually be very little resourcing or actually considerable and strong support. And when you put those together, you start to see that actually when you are in those situations, you're working in very, very different contexts. And so what that means is that when we then place on top of that various sorts of climatic scenarios, and we just put together one which just tried to illustrate this particular trend towards compounding effects, multiple effects, cascading impacts. But even if you hold that constant, and even if you have just a simply sort of hypothetical speculation on that, the resultant wind tunneling, as it's called, allows you to actually understand the sorts of ways in which you need to go about improving and strengthening your services. And in particular, what we tried to emphasise, and I'm indebted to Adriana for this lovely diagram, which is a systems map of the adaptation context for emergency management services. What it really emphasises is the need to understand ourselves systemically now, the need to understand the relationships that we're already entwined with, sometimes intentionally, sometimes unintentionally, which enable or constrain our ability to act in certain ways. And so it really underlines that at the end of the day, there's a whole lot of stuff we can do right now, even if we don't have completely accurate climate scenarios for 5, 10, 20 years' time. So much of what we can do is based on rethinking and understanding where we are now. And so just to come back to this idea of the relationship, the spiral between vulnerabilities and impacts, when you start to think about this and you start to appreciate all of the relationships and systems that we're part of, then you start to actually understand that sort of mathematically speaking, we need ways to link together these flowing risks. Now, I'm no mathematician, but I did used to like it a lot. And it does strike me that the idea of an exponential increase in average global temperatures, exponential increase in climatic extremes, etc., that language that we hear frequently actually does a disservice to us if we're to really understand the sort of futures we face. Because actually we need to start thinking about things in much more interlinked ways. And one mathematical way to do this is to think in terms of combinatorial relationships, where you start multiplying things together and again and again. And that's when you start to get the really steep curves. So if you think about that exponential growth curve, the blue one there as the climatic changes, the red one as our shifts in vulnerability, you put those together, you start to see the really steep changes that we're facing. So this is something that we're investigating a little bit, not explicitly in those mathematical terms, but through a really exciting new NHRA project that Adriana touched on yesterday, called Understanding the Resilience of Lifelines for Regional and Remote Communities, which we're doing in collaboration with our good colleague, Paul Ryan at the Australian Resilience Centre. And as Adriana touched on yesterday, I'll just go over this quickly. By lifelines, we're talking about critical infrastructure, but not just critical infrastructure. It's also the services and the supply chains and the people. Understanding that these are not separate columns on a sheet, right? These are all intertwined. Critical infrastructure doesn't work without other services, certainly doesn't work without workers, nor can services work without critical infrastructure, etc. So we're really starting to look at these sorts of interconnections. And one of the sort of, I guess, just broad points about this is that this move from thinking in terms of kind of hard infrastructure towards lifelines in more systemic terms, and particularly what's called soft systems terms, is actually similar to the sort of shift from a kind of risk-based approach, hard risk-based approach, through to more what's called resilience thinking. And so this idea, this phrase of lifeline resilience shifts a kind of two-dimensional paradigm shift, if you like, in terms of understanding the complex systems that we're part of. Now, we're only 2 weeks in, so I'll leave it there as far as results, but that's where we're going with that. So let me just quickly move on to some of the key challenges, including this really important question, I think, of understanding how impacts propagate. I've talked about these feedbacks, I've talked about relationships, but what actually are the mechanisms by which things are connected? Well, let me just highlight here that one of the key regional risks identified by our IPCC group for Australia and New Zealand is the inability of institutions and governance systems to manage climate risks. And one of the reasons this is highlighted as a key risk, if you think of risk as likelihood and consequences, is there seems to be a fairly high likelihood of this. And you have to remember we were writing this in the midst of the Black Summer bushfires with a particular sort of response there. And at the same time, consequences. And it's the consequential nature of some institutions and organisations that is particularly important and that helps us to understand how impacts propagate. So if we think about any activity that we're involved in, any sort of operations, it's fairly obvious once you start thinking about it, some of the ways in which these mechanisms of impact occur. The most obvious, the one that gets most attention, of course, is physical damage to equipment and to environment. Now, I want to draw your attention to this image here. It's a little bit dark, but this was hot off the press. This is off Vana Dimitrio's phone from her brother this morning. This is near Seymour. This is Coleman Trains. This is millions of dollars worth of signalling equipment that was flooded overnight in Seymour. So that is an operational impact there because of direct physical damage to very, very important and enabling equipment for others. So thank you, Vana, and your brother for sharing that. At the same time, of course, we know from COVID that disruptions to supply chains is another key mechanism by which these things occur. And I do quite a lot of work with farmers, and I know, for example, it's the ability to get supplies out, particularly stuff like milk, cold chains, that's very impactful. It's also the disruption to services, sometimes those intangible and invisible things that we rely on and we turn around and suddenly find they're not working. Think about any kind of workplace. Universities are kind of live labs for this, as I'll get to. Including things like finance, which of course was one of those findings around the impacts of Black Summer in terms of people's inability to use FPOS, and impacts on human operators. Now, this question of human operators, otherwise known as workers, is something that colleagues and I have been investigating in the Climate Resilience Living Lab that we're running with Victorian government funding at RMIT, at least until the end of the year. And what we've done is that with the help of 6 unions, and unions are a great resource for researchers because they allow us to talk directly to research individuals from across industries and organisations without the filtering effect or censoring effect of any organisation. By doing that, and we did it also, thanks a call out to Friends of the Earth for helping to foster that relationship, we were able to speak to over 1,200 workers about the impacts they've already experienced. This is to date. Now, these people are not climate change researchers, disaster researchers, but they were able to articulate a wide range of ways in which they've already been impacted. Some of them are those direct ones. It's the outdoor workers in the hot conditions. We know that's a vital, vital issue. But it's offices, it's also people working in services, it's people working in retail, it's right across the board. There were the health impacts, but there was also stuff like hours. Some people lost jobs, lost hours, lost shifts. 2% had even lost jobs altogether. Others had much greater increased responsibilities. There are the other impacts in the workplace which made work so much harder, the blackouts that my colleagues from RMIT are experiencing right now in Castlemaine. It's also agitated clients, agitated colleagues, and impacts beyond the workplace that mean that people can't focus and get to work, do their work, including the loss of transport services, such as the rail services near Seymour that we just saw. So that brings me to this other challenge, which is thinking about the particular effects of these impacts propagating via enabling institutions and organisations, and the fact that the effects on such enablers that, of course, propagate further impacts. So if we think about emergency services and disaster risk reduction, for example, we know that they are so enabling, not only in those immediate disaster contexts, but need to be enabling in this wider world of climate change adaptation. They're necessary, but not sufficient. And so it's about building those bridges, which is stuff that I think NHRA is really important for. At the same time, we have to appreciate that these services, as the project we did with RIOS indicated, are a target for adaptation. We need to actually adapt them for a climate changed world as well, in terms of all sorts of things, not just equipment, but also things like governance and leadership, HR, of course, stakeholder management, financial management, these sorts of things. And they, emergency management services are also joined in this category, of course, by the research sector, universities, research groups like CSIRO, research funding organisations like NHRA. I've been doing quite research over the last year or two on the effects on universities. There's a whole range of impacts listed there, and again, some hot off the press from this morning, such as warnings that Deakin are sending out to some of its students in some of the regional campuses. Already we're seeing major issues in this regard, and these are ongoing and serious. And I don't, I'd be very interested to speak to anyone here who has been affected, and also just want to acknowledge how distressing this can be. On research particularly, there are particular types of impacts. So for example, smoke doesn't like, smoke is bad for a lot of scientific equipment. Being burnt out is even worse. As a colleague of mine, the physical geographer James Watson and I wrote, in the midst of the Black Summer fires, research is not immune to climate change. Climate change is not just a topic. It's not just a new project. It's not even just a new course that we can teach students. This is something we are living. It's a context that we are part of. And sometimes it's climate change research itself that's impacted, as in the case of the hail that destroyed the glass houses at ANU and CSIRO, which actually we're looking at drought-resistant crops. But also it affects all sorts of research on music, research on marketing, every discipline, every department. And we've learnt some lessons from COVID, which are very useful here to apply. At the same time, these are the non-climatic vulnerabilities which make us more vulnerable, more at risk of climatic impacts as well. So we always need to read these things in that double way. This is both lessons, but also real material risks that we're facing. And the fact that we are in this COVID situation really underlines the need for us to actually advance our adaptation faster than ever. And so finally, some research needs and opportunities. Well, the first one is, of course, to address this issue that the research sector and other enabling institutions and organisations are part of the context that we want to do research on. That poses risks and opportunities for research. One of the risks is that if we don't do it well, we look pretty silly. Same with emergency services, same for anyone in this field. If we don't actually turn around and apply the sorts of lessons and thinking that we're developing, there's actually a risk that we undermine our authority. And we're talking about a context in which there's already a whole lot of politicisation and questioning of some of the expertise and advice around these topic areas. So that's something to really consider. But at the same time, there's a huge opportunity here. The fact that we're all part of this great experiment, the fact that we are all part of real world labs, known as the world, means that we can actually sensitise our ability to collect and analyse information, analyse situations, and advance learning for ourselves and for others really, really quickly. And so things such as recognising that we're part of these physical, socio-technical and other systems, something that kind of rolls off the tongue, but actually to analyse it, to analyse what does that look like for me in this research project, in this department, in this organisation. What does that actually mean? We're good at things like stakeholder mapping, but let's actually map our electricity providers. Let's map our water utility providers. Let's map the financial flows that keep us paid and understand the sorts of vulnerabilities that we face. And then collaboratively inquiring. So this is very much part of the sort of approach that people in this field are already moving towards. So this is simply underlining the benefits of those collaborative ways of learning together, learning about how our operations work, how systems work, how they're changing due to a whole range of intersecting drivers, keeping our eye on that climatic change, but not being blinded by that. Also understanding the need to consider all of the other ripple effects, other changes, and to think about how things might change against our will, passively if you like, but also how they might change for the better if we actively join up and start to adapt in a transformational way. And so here what we're talking about is actually thinking about research in a kind of much more engaged, sensitive way. It's about thinking about the surface area of research, if you like. And sorry, this is something happening on the screen here. Thinking about, the fact that regardless of what we're researching, we're part of this real world lab. We're part of perhaps a living lab, creating an observatory. And again, please come and talk to me if you're interested in this, because I really genuinely, desperately want to set up a climate change impacts observatory. Understand that things that sometimes seem like boring old compliance things, monitoring, evaluation, and the kind of missing piece, adaptation, responding to what you find, is actually a learning opportunity, particularly for climate change adaptation, because that context is changing. We can learn a lot as we do those things. And reimagining ourselves as part of a research system, thinking purposefully about how we want that system to look into the future, what we need to do to get there, and how we might be more enabling of others than ever before. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Lauren. We will, I think we have another speaker now, so thank you very much for that. We'll have questions, I think, at the end for both of our speakers. So now let me please introduce Zoe Robinson, who was appointed by the Governor in New South Wales to the role of the Advocate for Children and Young People in January 2020. Zoe holds a law degree and a Masters of Human Rights. She previously worked as a solicitor for firms in New South Wales for Deloitte in internal strategy, and was the CEO of the New South Wales peak body for youth homelessness. Prior to commencing her appointment as the as the advocate, Zoe worked at the Department of Premier and Cabinet. Her role was focused on breaking disadvantage. Zoe firmly believes that children and young people should be given every opportunity to succeed and set themselves up for success, and that they should have the opportunity to choose what that means to them. Zoe also believes that all children and young people should be heard, listened to, and be central to the work of government, business, and the community. And we've seen that crossover in many of our speakers. Did Liam, yeah? Yep. Liam, I'll also introduce Liam McGovern, who will also be talking to us as well. Liam is a policy advisor with the Advocate for Children and Young People. In this capacity, he assists in a number of research projects and policy development into issues affecting children and young people, both individually and as a community. Prior to this, he worked as a social worker and program coordinator, working with survivors of torture and trauma to increase their resilience and develop connection to community and self. So welcome both to Zoe and Liam. Thank you.
So I too would like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we meet today and which we have travelled from, and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. Thank you for having us here today, and not speaking for Liam, but in every conference you have that speaker where people go, eh? And I'm happy to be that today with the Masters of Human Rights in here, because we don't necessarily come from a field of studying solely in this. Our role and my role, as you just heard, is in every other state called a commissioner, but in New South Wales, just to be different, we've called it the advocate. And so the key part of what I do is not use technology well. Oh, the big one. Is to promote the welfare, safety and wellbeing of all children and young people in New South Wales. And so when I took this job in 2020, I had, like everyone else, seen all of the newspapers that were covering the bushfires. And one of the things that stood out for me is, one, it was a one-year appointment, so I knew we could run hard at something that really mattered. But secondly, that children and young people were front and centre in media and on papers, but no one was actually asking them how they were, what they felt, and what that they wanted to see in their communities. And I'm not saying that people within communities don't do that well. I'm saying that from a government perspective, children and young people, when you look at preparedness documents or when you look at response to crisis documents, children and young people as themselves are not actually mentioned as individuals. They're mentioned as part of a family unit, or they're spoken about, but they're often not spoken to. So this is the key part of my role, which is to go out and speak to children and young people. All of our work starts with children and young people. So it doesn't matter what my view is as an adult or what my experience is as an adult. We go into those communities and we sit with children and young people. One of the best pieces of advice I ever got, which is from an amazing Aboriginal auntie, was that I needed to get comfortable being uncomfortable, which means that all of the things that I might know or all of the views that I might have, all of that bias or whatever we want to call it is put aside. And you go into a community and you sit with children and young people. So Liam will talk about this work because, to be fair, as head of agency, you can always take credit for things, but we all know there's actual people who do all of the heavy lifting and work. And so I'm not here to take all of that credit, but I will take some of it. We spent a lot of time on the road going out into community. Now, whilst it was bushfire, we knew in New South Wales we'd also experienced drought, prolonged drought, flooding, mice plague and all of that. And so it wasn't just talking about what had happened in your backyard. We wanted to make sure that we were reflecting and working with all children and young people in New South Wales and whatever they had experienced. And so when we talk about things like hazards or disasters, children and young people are often just sitting there in the space in which they are normally in. So, you know, they are seeing people around them panic. They're seeing the responses that adults have in that situation. They're seeing trucks come in and out of their streets, helicopters fly over, and often they're sitting there without the information and without being consulted about what it is that they would like to see. So we did this piece of work and we worked very closely with Professor Mary O'Kane and that team. And I have to say she was really wonderful and very honest, because she herself said, we're going into communities and doing this consultation, but we are fully aware that actually we're not actually hearing from children and young people. So people would come in and talk about their experiences, but they hadn't facilitated a space for children and young people to come in and do that. And so that was very clearly the role that we wanted to play, and we worked very closely with them in terms of giving them the information. With all of our work, it goes back to the children and young people. So in terms of that research loop or the way that we all do participation, often we will do it, we will take the information from people and we won't go back to them. It was a very conscious effort of ours to make sure that we went back to children and young people to demonstrate to them the work that they had given us, but also how we were continuing to work with government about the impacts of those recommendations. So as I said, you can always take credit for the work, and I'd love to take credit for all of this work, but actually this was a big piece of work that Liam did. And so I have brought a young person to talk about the work and what he did.
Thank you, Zoe. I played a very small part. I am going to downplay my role. I played a very small part in a much bigger project. So as Zoe said, we ran hard, and we did run hard. We spent about 7 months on this project. As any good research project does, it involves a range of methodologies. As Zoe mentioned, we had the privilege of sitting in with Professor O'Kane to each of their community consultations for their inquiry. And that was a real privilege for us. Probably where we found it most beneficial is we ran focus groups with over 400 young people who had been directly infected by, as Zoe said, predominantly bushfires and floods, but we also started this project just as COVID started. So there was a mix of disasters. We also undertook a poll, and the reason we did that with 1,000 young people was we didn't want to just understand the impacts on those directly affected. We wanted to understand the impacts of their community, to their family, to their household, just as we heard this morning. And then we also partnered with Deloitte, who did a grey literature, like desktop analysis of how young people and children have both been involved in preparation and recovery from disasters, but also how previous disasters have impacted them. And all of those findings, after 6.5 months of fieldwork, were put into a report which were released in July of 2020, called the Children and Young People's Experience of Disaster. That report was, before we released it, we worked quite closely with each of the New South Wales government agencies on recommendations specific to them, and we continue to do that. But probably the big kind of piece that came out of that report was this. As we heard this morning, there are a lot of disaster resilience frameworks and documents out there. This is us trying to complement that work. We're not trying to remove anything or say one is more important. This is us designing a framework that puts children and young people, it puts their experiences and their needs at the centre of disaster preparation, during a disaster, and then disaster recovery. The framework itself touches on kind of all the domains that young people experience. So as you can see there, things like education, employment, and housing. It lists kind of disaster resilience factors, which you'll see in the second column. These are things that should exist for children and young people without a disaster. Everyone should have the sense to belong, everyone should feel connected. But this framework recognises that in a disaster, because the experiences of children and young people can be so different to those of adults, these are the things that we have to work on as a community, as a society, as an organisation for us, that we really embed back in children and young people's lives. They may be diminished, they may be destroyed, but they're the types of things that young people themselves have told us makes them feel safe, makes them feel connected. And then the last thing the framework does, and as we heard this morning, this will be different for every community and every disaster, but it speaks to some of the main challenges that the domains that young people experience may face in a disaster. So it talks about, in education, for example, the destruction of schools, or the closure of schools, or having to work from home, as we saw in COVID. What the framework seeks to do, using the voices and experiences of the young people we spoke to, is give their solutions to government, to community, to business, about how we can work collectively and collaboratively to really include children and young people in how we prepare, how we prevent disasters, but also how we just understand that the role they play and the experience they have is very different. In terms of our office, I think it's fair to say this was, as I said, a big piece of work. It's a piece of work that continues to shape the work that we do. As I said, we still work closely with each of the government agencies to whom we made recommendations, and to their credit, each of them have come to us very willingly and very strongly. But probably where we saw the biggest impact, we've just started to see it come out. And I think it's fair to say this is probably in following on as we've seen the continuing floods in New South Wales. We've just started a piece of work which very much stemmed from this report and the findings of this report, which Zoe is going to go into. Thank you.
Liam. So I think Liam was very generous then. When we did this piece of work, there were agencies that were very keen to hear it, and there were agencies that wanted us to change things. Now, I'm an independent statutory officer, so you actually can't, heads up, ever ask me to change anything in a report. It's one of the great benefits of being a statutory officer. But what you certainly can't ask me to do is change the voice of children and young people. So their experience is their experience. And if we take it as them thinking about the structure in which they live in and it's a criticism, it's actually not that. It's their observations and their feelings and what that they've gone through. And so one of the big pushes that we had was we accept that there might be a government policy or a government response to something. And I mean this with great respect, and I actually mean it on the basis that I think we need to be doing better in government. Children and young people don't necessarily know what agency is delivering what to them. And that's because they know the thing that they need and they can articulate that, but they're not necessarily certain that they had to go somewhere to get it. And so what we've certainly learned and we've seen is this time, well, not this time around, but we've tried better in terms of that coordination of response. But again, I had the fortune of working with the Deputy Commissioner and going into flood affected areas afterwards. We spoke to a number of children and young people. Now, we were told certain things, and then when we spoke to children and young people, it was very different. And the other layer of complexity I want to add to that is that often in businesses, we define children in different cohorts. So if you are 0 to 15, you might get something in particular. If you're 16 to 18, you might get something in particular. So you're nodding. And if you're 18 to 24, you might get something. So when we've designed policies in response to disaster, we actually haven't considered the fact that it probably should be agnostic. It shouldn't be based necessarily on how we deal with the child protection system or how we deal with youth justice. So we had 16-year-olds who weren't part of a family, so were independently living, but weren't entitled to receive independent support. So the good news is we have received funding from Resilience New South Wales. And this is exciting because, exciting and heartbreaking, I guess, because this is the first time there is a stream for young people. And that is looking at, so we've got the infrastructure, you've got community. This is one specifically for young people. And so I'm very keen to speak to the people on the ground because we're very conscious that I don't necessarily want people who aren't in those areas to go into those areas. We want to try and support people. But we are hiring 5 dedicated youth-focused people who will be able to connect into the communities and the needs of what those young people need. And their role will be to support, to provide information back to us, but also to all the agencies there. And so what we're excited about is actually that children and young people from this work are now becoming independently front and centre in terms of the responses, and that people have understood that as young as 6 and as old as 25, they can tell you the things that matter to them and the things that they would like to see in response to this. But importantly, I wouldn't be doing my job if you didn't hear from children. Now, do I have to do something special to play this? Here you go.
Don't forget, like, shelter us from it. We're better off knowing about it and being educated to deal with it than just being wrapped in blankets and covered in pissed.
This whole side was on fire. All of the was on fire, and then the train tracks were also on fire, and then like our car was going a bit up. There was no way we could get out.
With me, we're helping each other get ready for the fires. Like my dad and my neighbour were helping cut down the chunky fires.
RSPCA got all of the horses and animals and all of our dogs and stuff out, so they came in with the SES, took all of our animals and then came out.
The Monday before, like the big Saturday, we got a friend somewhere saying like you have an hour until your house burns, so we kind of got that and just left. They didn't really warn us. It's not. They didn't warn us. We probably would have wanted more like help and like more detail of what was going on. Yeah.
Don't ask us anything. They come and talk about it, but they don't actually ask. I think the community needed a lot of communication, but they weren't getting it.
We didn't really have a place to stay, so I guess having somewhere where you could go, having someone tell you what happens. So if you're in an area that is affected, we didn't know what happened to our house for like a week.
You could just like educate them, so it's not scary. You just know how bad it can be and what to do.
Making sure that all kids know what's going to happen during fires or during disasters.
Friends helping friends, and it works because like country needs friends to help other people.
And it's just that like sense of community as well. Like I know it's really bad when you have all these natural disasters, but like at the same time you can also see like the community coming in together.
There needs to be better funding to firefighters and the fire affected. And there also needs to be a lot more listening to firefighters, listening to the scientists, and having a long-term approach to the fires and disasters.
You can find all of this on our website. Thanks for having us here today.
Thank you very much for that presentation. I think now we will move to our panel. I'd just like to call our chair, Iain Mackenzie, to the stage. Iain is a board member of our organisation, so thank you, Iain.
And we're going to leave the hard part about summing up the whole past couple of days to Deb in a little while. Thank you, and it's good to be back. I'm glad we've got, I think the most have stayed for there. We've got a little bit of attrition, but it's good to see the diehards here. And can I start again, and obviously this morning, and please my personal acknowledgement of the traditional custodians of the land we're meeting on today, the Turrbal and the Yuggera people, and pay my respect to elders past, present and emerging, and my thanks to all First Nations people, especially those here and online. I thought I had this session worked out. While I do that, I'm going to welcome to the stage two more people, Mike Wassing and Barry Hunter. Barry is from NAILSMA, the Northern Australia Indigenous Sea and Land Management. I keep getting that word wrong. Alliance, thank you, Barry. That just means a trip that I need to come up and visit. And Mike is currently the Acting Commissioner of Queensland Fire and Emergency Service, but a deputy that has served in operational roles looking after all aspects of the service, and also served in other jurisdictions across the country, so well placed. In this session, you know, through the last 3 days, I was standing here and I kept looking at this banner behind me, and I don't know if everyone can see it, and the remit of NHRA. And it talks about floods, fires, cyclones, earthquakes, tsunamis. And on this side, we talk about, you know, resilience to all hazards and disaster risk reduction. And these themes kept coming out during the week. And I think, yes, that's what we do, but why do we do it? And I think this session has just nailed it for me, the last two speakers and the people that are on stage now, because we are about future, we are about youth, we are about country, and we are about government and governance around what we do, and making a better future for our youth. If I have a single takeaway from this week, it was the words of one of our young researchers a few days ago, Ness, who, when talking to her mother about undertaking a PhD, and her mother said, I don't care what area of it is you study, I'm paraphrasing, as long as you take your children with you. And I think, you know, whether it's literal or metaphoric, that is surely our role in researching how we make this a more resilient country into the future. We're going to take some questions from you now. This is all about you and your opportunity to ask on those too. But because this week has been so future themed, and it's difficult to do that, and even Brendan, I'm sure Brendan in his first week at NEMA was wanting to sit down and think strategically. He has left here to jump on a plane to go to Tasmania because the pressures of the events that we face are relentless. But we need to imagine the future. This week we've heard stories, many perspectives, much research has been explained to us. We've heard we need to solve problems and not just identify them. It's easier to identify than actually get in and solve, and the big problem. We've had a glimpse into the climate future. We've met our future researchers. So how do we take that forward? So with our four panelists, I've asked them to think about something to kick this session off. And that's, instead of just thinking about the future, I've asked them to go into the future, 10 years into the future, and think back and just talk to us for a few minutes about those areas that they're involved with and they think about, and that notion of, I think, future youth, country and government. What is it that in 10 years' time they're going to be really proud of, having solved, been part of, identified and giving us a solution for? So, Mike, you've got a microphone in your hand, you're looking for the on button.
How's that one? It's better. Thank you, and thanks again for the opportunity, and thank you, Zoe, and thank you, Lauren, for those presentations. To the context of your question, for me, there's a couple of things. The first would be that we are able then to reflect back and think about that we're a trusted, and when I say trusted, it's not just about that we're good at what we do, but it's also that we're reliable and we're sincere in what we do and how we do it. But that we're trusted for being the go-to people and expertise around risk and around partnerships. And when I say partnerships, partnerships at every level, with community, with agencies, with the diversity that we actually have across Australia and certainly within Queensland as well. The second one in terms of reflection would be that we are active leaders in the public-private investment in terms of public safety. So we're currently well known as RMIT Services for our response capabilities. And we've got really strong partnerships, and we continue to develop some of those partnerships, and some of those are with Barry and Lismore in the north, and they're very early partnerships and fantastic opportunities. But in reflecting back, they're stronger partnerships that are not just about talking about things, but we've actually completed a range of different things as well. And the third one, I think, is the fact that just recently in the last couple of years, Queensland RMIT Services have actually done a range of bodies of work for hazard specific, but also more broadly just this year released the State Risk Report, which is a report that projects to 2060 in terms of risk. So it's not looking at current state and backwards, it's actually looking forward. And that's been informed by a whole lot of partners in terms of Geoscience Australia, CSIRO, and a whole lot of other partners to inform that body of work, and our risk team that are here today also. I want to acknowledge their team and their work. But that work has not only just informed the activities and the strategies, but we're well progressed, and that they're really tangible and they're making a difference, whether that be in the adaptation or whether that be in the mitigation components of our responsibilities in terms of a changing climate, or whether it be fundamentally focused on those that are most vulnerable. And I think listening again to the conversations here today about vulnerability and exposure, I'd like to be thinking that we have made a difference to not just individual lives, but collective lives, and minimise the impact, or particularly those who are most vulnerable. And not just we as an agency, but we've enabled others to do that as well. And again, it was wonderful to see some of that conversation around neighbours and youth helping each other, and some of that language there. So that for us, it's about being able to reflect back and being, we're an enabler for others, not just being the go-to people for specific things.
All right, and Mike, I'll ask you to stretch even further, not just QFES and not just Queensland, but let's go national. And you've got the ability to affect how nationally, as a group of broader than emergency services, we'll park the blue and red lights, but government, what is it that we need? What's the big problem we need to have solved?
I think here and now actually is there's, firstly for mine, I think there's an acknowledgement, and we're just having this conversation actually at a national forum yesterday with Brendan and others around jurisdictions. The first is actually acknowledging, we talk about consecutive and compounding disasters and the impact on communities. And the language we tend to use is that that's kind of coming. But I think as everyone in this room understands, we're actually in it. And we saw examples today, and we're all probably tuned into what's occurring, not just in Australia, in New South Wales and Victoria currently around flooding, but we're actually been in it for several years. And so I think firstly, there's an acknowledgement of that context, that we're actually in that environment, that we actually have more vulnerability in the system and in our communities and even in our workforces that we know about. And we've got a lot of energy currently from a lot of people, all of us in this room plus others, that want to make a difference and are making a difference. But at a national level, I think we need to have clarity in terms of focus, clarity around coordination of those efforts, because otherwise we're running a risk of actually having a bit of a sugar hit and small tactical impacts, but not a system impact. And again, it was wonderful to hear the speakers just talk about the systems component and actually understanding at a national level what the system is and where do you actually, where in the system are you most impactful for mitigation or any type of investment at any given time, because it moves very quickly. And there's probably a whole lot of other conversation in terms of national aspects, which I won't go to now. Thank you.
I'd love to take that at some stage. Zoe, what will you look back on?
I probably can answer Vanna's question in that. So our hope is that we know the RFS in New South Wales has a young leaders program. So our hope is that whilst it's great that I occasionally get seats at a table, that young people can actually be heard in their communities and lifted up to leaders in those communities. So I hope that when we look back on 10 years' time, it's not this crap, we didn't involve them at the time. It's we know that we need to consult them. We need to be with them. We need to walk with them. We need to lift them up. And it's not just future looking, let's embed it now. And it's one of the recommendations that communities and local council should start working with young people now. So that would be the hope.
And is there national coordination against you as an advocate and the other commissioners around that vision?
We do meet together. We have different priorities. We did have the great fortune of meeting with Mr. Colvin when he was in there. I would say that when you're talking about structures, we can all do better in that space and making sure that we're coordinated. But depending on the time, what we've learned is now as other states go through it, we'll be putting all of our resources into supporting the other commissioners and saying, these are the things that we've learned. Here's the information we have. May it work for you.
Thank you. And Barry, in terms of NAILSMA and the vision for 10 years and the end purpose and coming back and saying, we've really got it right.
Yeah, thanks, Iain. Firstly, I just want to pay my respects to the Yagara and Turrbal people. And I guess in response to that question, if we look at the role that we're currently playing and the partnership that we have with NRHA and the partnership that Mike spoke about, working with emergency services institutions across government agencies across Northern Australia. In 10 years' time, I like to think that NAILSMA has a reduced role in that, and that direct relationship between government and community is ongoing and occurring. And it does happen, particularly in remote communities where, there's resilience and equipment and, emergency response training. But there's a need also to increase that within the regional and rural areas as well. And to sort of have that same level of focus that sort of goes into remote areas. So while NAILSMA plays that role in facilitation and enabling currently, I like to think that we can reduce that and we go and do other things, and that partnership and that discussion just keeps rolling on. And I think it's important in regards to the partnership because being able to look at in those areas, quite often those first responders will be those community people, and being able to have them at a level of skills and qualifications and training, and the confidence as well within in the role that they need to play to be able to play it effectively. So I guess it's that, and I guess the other thing within that, so like that skilled trained workforce, and that level of competence right across the board, that recognition that there's some really skilled and qualified people in communities now, and being able to build and develop those people, particularly young people as well, and engage them within the conversation going into the future.
Yeah, thank you. And I was going to ask about that with the youth, and particularly in the ranges, and that's a really important part. Thank you. Lauren, I know you can't look back and say I changed the climate, but what will make you happy in 10 years?
Well, I'll focus on the research sector. So presumably the question's about a preferable scenario, not necessarily a probable one, hopefully a probable one. So in 10 years' time, I'm hoping that we will see a strong and vibrant research sector, one that's really operating and recognises itself as a system, and is really working together collaboratively, not just to be highly productive and excellent and impactful, those words we like to bandy around, but is practically well adapted and highly resilient. And that means that we actually have to address existing vulnerabilities in the research sector. It means that we have to build in some redundancies. So this is about stopping with all of the the cuts, making sure that we're actually building up a research sector based on people that are thriving, universities that are really looking after their staff, for example. So that's one aspect of it. And what that would mean is that then research is able to operate as a space for the sorts of conversations we're having here. So just expanding on that sort of role, a space for learning and really diversifying that notion of what counts as research so that we can really build research as a foundational skill. By that, I mean inquiry-based learning as a foundational skill in the adaptation that we're going to have rolled out by 10 years from now, so that we're able to sit and reflect as we're doing here today.
Okay, and you mentioned addressing your own vulnerabilities in that research space. What are some of those risks and vulnerabilities?
Well, they're so multi-level, right? So, you know, we can bring them home to ourselves. We are those workers that are reporting on difficulty getting to work, for example, the complications that our domestic sphere, implies. And I'm racing home to Melbourne this afternoon in order to relieve my dad to get to Bendigo where it's badly flooded. You know, these are the sorts of complications. But from a more research specific thing, maybe I could illustrate that with an example from the Millennium Drought. So I did a project there where I trained up some local women in Northwest Victoria to go out across a large area to sit down in farm households to actually ask about that experience of going through that drought. And it's a project that we sort of patched together bits of funding so that it could continue as long as the drought kept going. So we had to find more funding and more funding. And then we turn around and we find that actually it's not a drought project, it's a climate variability project, because the whole area became flooded in the 2011 floods. And what that meant was that I was suddenly managing interviewers who were flooded. And so we were having trouble getting into the houses to ask households around how they were going with the drought/flood, because the people we were working with were going through the drought/flood. And this is areas around Charlton, for example. And so that just, it was just a really extreme kind of wake-up call in terms of we're not separate from what we're talking about here, and at the same time, understanding that we had to bring that experience into what we're writing, into what we were doing. So that's just an example. But there's all sorts of things. I don't know if anyone here's a journal editor, but trying to find peer reviewers, really hard. It's going to get really, really hard. So that's a really, really core thing, which reflects one of the questions there. Funding, publication timelines, all of these sorts of things, everything that relies particularly on voluntary labour and goodwill is particularly threatened if we don't adapt. At the same time, it could be the secret source of adaptation for us.
Okay, thank you. But Barry, there's a question that's come in from the floor. It's asking whether we think there's special needs for our First Nations children in disaster risk reduction and disaster resilience. I wonder from a NAILSM perspective if you wanted to talk particularly around that. And then Zoe, I don't know if you've got a view on that as well. So.
If you look at sort of where those the demographic of Aboriginal communities, the biggest population within that demographic is that sort of, and I might be wrong, but between 5 to 15. So and the carers for those people, those young people, are often in some cases parents, but in a lot of cases, they may be grandparents. So it's an interesting approach that's needed to be able to, one, get the messages and to define messages to that demographic, and to be able to make that message appropriate as well. So in regards to the question around special need, I guess it's being able to recognise that who that demographic is and how you get those messages across. And quite often those kids are disengaged from within their community, particularly in some remote areas. And they, there's quite often a struggle with that sort of culture, law and traditional culture compared to what they see on TV, the American cap and baseball culture and basketball culture and stuff like that. So yeah, being able to, I guess, cater that message and to define that message and to speak to those kids in their language I think it's where the attention is required. I guess the other thing that I want to talk to is go back to, so being able to build that resilience around culture and cultural programs. And we, see in some circumstances where that is successful, and the kids will engage with it, with that, and gives them that strong sense of identity and knowing who they are. But usually the funding in and around those programs, sort of are pretty, meager. So being able to identify and engage, and whether that happens sort of, out of school hours or during school hours, but having culture and language, and being able to build that sense of identity and sense of home within young people, I think is important.
Yeah, thanks, Barry. Zoe?
I would have slightly worded it different in terms of the special strengths.
Yes.
So when we started this report, the first place we went to was Mogo, and Mogo was 90% destroyed and obviously very close to Bateman's Bay. And one of the things that was incredibly remarkable there is how the communities led with Aboriginal and cultural sponsors in terms of how they cared for each other and how they wanted to go back onto the land and talk to each other about what had happened and what that means. And so one of the very clear recommendations in our report was, understanding cultural practices and investing in those programs. But what we certainly saw, especially in Mogo, was that the young people had led that and the community was very much driven around that. And so some of the very clear work that happened was starting there and working with it. So I'd say that what I learned from that is that there is, with the tens of thousands of years of knowledge, there is something that we need to be working with all children on what that looks like. And Mogo and Bateman's Bay was a perfect example of children leading in the strength that they had there.
Excellent. And while you've got the microphone, there's another question I think is related. It's about how do we have those conversations with children and speak about risk without causing anxiety or unnecessary stress?
And I mean, that, whilst we're talking about hazards and research and how we do that, I think one of the things that worries me is that we stop before we start. And so we do kind of get a bit caught up in that. There are experts around you who you can work with, who you can bring social workers in the room. You can do, anyone who knows me knows that I love the puppies. And so you can do bring puppies in, make it a safe space for people, but it doesn't have to be in the very formal capacity. And certainly sitting down and saying, the conversations that we had very clear questions, but some of the things that you start with is like, what's working well in your community? Now that can be many things in various situations. So my concern is that often, and I'm certainly speaking from a government perspective or in the roles, is that some people go, I can't do it because it might be too hard and it might be very traumatic. That's very true. So work with them about what they need. So we've just done other work in terms of out-of-home care and kids and youth justice. What do you need? Who's the support? Who's the person that you want with you? What will help you? And don't say no because you're worried about that. Build the system around it to make sure that they can, because otherwise we just keep saying it's too hard. We can't have those conversations and we continue to lose these voices. So when we did this, we made sure that we were doing it in spaces that felt good, that were children and young people friendly, that, if somebody needed to come in with pets or what, we just did the things that we needed to do to make sure that it was a good space. And so work with services, work with those who are experts in the space and provide options, work with families, work with community. And if all else fails, bring in puppies.
My daughter would agree 100%. Am I on? Am I off? It's on? Oh, there we go. Thanks. Lauren, there's a question there I'm sure the researchers have been dying for me to ask. How do we maintain credibility of science and research when everybody's on Facebook and there are all those experts out there?
Absolutely. Well, we just tell them we're right, don't we? No. The difference between an individual on Facebook or just any individual and an individual speaking from the basis of, let me call it, academic research, is that academic research is a system. We don't speak alone. This is the whole standing on the shoulders of giants thing, but it's also the fact that the research goes through a huge number of checks and balances. We have methodologies, we have peer review, we have a whole range of different social infrastructures within the academic world that mean that the ways in which we generate knowledge are not just through our own personal experience and our own conversations and social networks. Now, I've been advocating for us to pay more attention to our personal experience, but that's to actually bring it into the laboratory that is our own lives and minds, if you like, and to then work it into the research system. So it's because we're speaking out of a research system, a huge infrastructure, the big machine that Paul Edwards talks about in terms of climate science, for example, that really distinguishes what you're saying on the basis of that mode of inquiry versus a mode of inquiry based merely on chat rooms and Google.
I think it's a challenge, and although I haven't read the section yet, I know that Alistair Dawson, I don't know if he's still in the room, but engaged Professor Belastantic to look at social media in particular to the recent flooding event. So there is that need to recognise individual opinions, but of course it's not that scientific rigour, which just reminds me of a little bit of what is research and something that challenges us all. The Edelman Trust Barometer, which is issued annually, shows that 66% of Australians don't trust us if we're a journalist, if we're in government, or if we're in business. I just wonder if anyone has an opinion on how we overcome the trust barrier with the public.
Can I just jump in there? I
was going to, yes.
Yeah. And I'll personalise this to not just myself, but my organisation. So we have a responsibility in the understanding and the communication associated with good research. And because we have the benefit of being a well-respected and trusted organisation, and that comes from a whole lot of other things. But, and I'll take the opportunity to also say, for us as Queensland Environmental Services, and for me personally, that's fundamental in the partnership that we have with Natural Hazards Research Australia. In that, whilst we get a whole lot of amazing input to our futures strategy and all the works and the strategies and the programs and the investment and our capabilities that we're doing, that's absolutely invaluable. But we have a reciprocal obligation and accountability to help communicate that and reinforce that and actually bring some of that research to the fore. So it's one thing again to say, oh, we want evidence-based decision making. It's actually really important that you help inform that research as end users, acknowledge and receive that research. And in some cases that can be really challenging. And I noticed that in Zoe, your point wasn't lost on me about you get a review or a report and you want someone wants to change it. I'll take the opportunity to address the other question up there around EA in that aspect. As agencies in terms of research or reviews or those sorts of things, we need to be really open to listening. As agencies, as an agency, we do lots of informing to the community. We also need to be listening, and in this context, listening to research or listening to reviews, and move past our ego with respect to was that wrong or right, and actually say, well, in the construct of the Inspector General's report into the South East Queensland floods, I don't read any blame into that in terms of, yes, we've got responsibilities around emergency alert and those sort of things. And again, that's a part of a broader warning system. And what we're doing about that is fundamentally educating, retraining people, supporting local government and our other partners that are the users and authorisers of that. We're just a system component of that. But more importantly, into the future, I'd like to think emergency alert is somewhat, currently it's only a tool anyway, but the future, based on the research that's already telling us this, is those sort of systems are almost in some respects past. So our focus is actually going past that. Yes, we'll address those concerns raised out of last year, but more importantly, what we're interested in is saying, hey, you live in a high risk location, whether that's riverine flooding or any particular hazard, doesn't matter. Our job is to make sure that you're aware of that, that you're in tune with that, and that you actually have behaviours that can be tuned into that and take the required action before, during and after, and not rely on an emergency alert and not rely on a fire truck or a SES crew or someone coming up to rescue you. And so they're the aspects, I think, in terms of that drive our organisation and drive our focus around some of those sort of capabilities. So I'll try to link the two a little bit there.
And I was going to talk in terms of trust of government and business and community. Obviously, children and young people are very, very conscious of a trust economy, and they're very good at reviews and all that. And so what I've learned in this job is you've got to accept who should be delivering that message to who you need to talk to. And so sometimes it will be, actually very rarely it'll be those people in politics, but you know, Dr. Chant was a very well-respected person in New South Wales. And so actually you just had to accept that when we were delivering some things, she was the best person placed to it. The one thing that I would say is that we also have to recognize that when you're talking about children and young people, if it's not genuine and if it feels forced, then be prepared to become a meme on TikTok. Like, it's just a reality of the fact that they are very engaged in who's communicating to them and when. And so make sure that the communication is genuine and meaningful, and you're not just attempting to have a crack on their socials, that you're actually trying to engage. And so we did a lot of work with an organisation called the Daily Oz, who communicate to young people all the time. And we accepted that we're not doing, it's not for us to do it. They've got a better reach. So the other thing I would say is sometimes if it's not you, figure out who it is. And then that's a good way to get your message across when it comes to research, when it comes to communicating with the customer that you're trying to serve.
Excellent, thank you. And just conscious of the time, and to wrap up, I'm going to pose one more question and just ask for a 30-second response from each of you. And Zoe, I hope you don't mind, I'm stealing your very technical term that you used in one of your answers there, and you went, oh crap. So what is your, oh crap, we have to?
Oh crap, we have to ask children and young people what matters to them.
Thank you. Lauren.
And oh crap, we need to adapt our enablers, our disaster risk reduction area, emergency services, our universities and research sector, or the effects will be felt far and wide.
Barry?
Oh crap. We need to be able to find a way to engage more effectively with those communities, Indigenous communities out there, and for the emergency response services to be a sort of culturally safe place for them to engage in.
Oh crap.
I feel so good about
I'm not sure I should have
This
that off.
is really catchy, isn't it? Oh crap. We need to get fair income about changing our capabilities, changing our focus and changing our investment as emergency service organisations to acknowledge those that are not in our service and those that do not wear uniforms that can do the doing, and our job is to help them.
Fantastic, thank you. And I'll wrap up on that note, and I'm going to hand the challenge back to Deb. Thank you very much, panel. Can you thank the panel with me?
Well, thank you very much, Iain, and thank you to our panellists for that very enlightening discussion. And at the end was very, very telling, actually, because I think that it's actually really highlighted a number of issues that we all feel that we need to address. And I think that for those of you that might have come into the room a little bit later, you may not know me, but my name is Deb Bunker. I'm the newly appointed CSO of Natural Hazards Research Australia. And so this to me has been a fabulous event as an introduction to both the organisation, but also an introduction to our stakeholders, all of you who have attended across the 3 days. It has really given me great insights into how the different issues that people feel are important in this sector, and also some of the solutions that you've already set sail on, you're already working very hard on to contribute to the sector and also to produce good outcomes for our communities and, you know, all of us, you know, that really need to have access to these solutions. So I would also like to thank, of course, my colleagues from Natural Hazards Research Australia for making this all possible. They've worked very hard over many months, but also the last 3 days to facilitate this process and to help us all be together and talk through these issues. So I think if we could all give them a round of applause. And also, I would like to give you all a round of applause for being here and joining in the spirit of this gathering and making these contributions. So thank you very much. So this is our last session, and I'm going to have to operate the big green button now. So please excuse me if my slides go a bit haywire, but I have been given the task of doing a wrap up and a bit of a closing thoughts on what we've been doing here over the last 3 days. So firstly, again, I would really like to acknowledge our traditional custodians of the land, the Turrbal and the Yuggera peoples, and pay my respects to their elders, past, present, emerging, and extend that respect to our First Nations people here today. We have met here to be able to work together, to learn together, to collaborate together. And I think I would really like to thank our First Nations people and the custodians of this land for making this all possible. We meet here because of their efforts to care for the land and make this place possible for us to be here. So I think over the last 3 days, I think we could probably all agree that our thinking is changing. We are really caught up in climate change. That's very, very evident. We've been talking a lot about that over the last few days. Our final session here today was certainly focused on that and what's been going on in developments in research in that area. Also, connection to country has been a very big talking point here as we start to try to reconnect to, you know, thousands and thousands of years of knowledge and wisdom on caring for country and understanding our country. Also, the impact of human activity. Many of the presentations I've been to have really been quite insightful on certainly the impact that we've had on this land and, you know, how we proceed to try to manage risk and minimise impact and build resilient society and communities. Also the hidden and not so hidden effects that we see on the land and on us. And so, you know, some of these things are quite obvious, the impacts that we see, but, you know, also the psychosocial impacts, the long-term health impacts, these things that, you know, we really don't see the effect of until probably way out into the future. So I think sort of surfacing those sorts of issues has been very critical for us. Also the extreme overlapping and cascading events. I think the graphic that Brendan displayed earlier is a very powerful indicator of what's been going on over the last year, which really shows some quite extraordinary impacts that we've seen in this term in terms of these events. And then also, you know, very much a very strong theme throughout all of our discussions and all of the presentations and the questions is really this notion of harnessing community. You know, we are powerful as a collective. So how do we actually unlock the knowledge and the wisdom and the understanding at a local level to work with our agencies, responders, our key organisations? So really, these themes have come out, you know, quite strongly for me. But of course, we come back to our vision. So as an organisation working with our stakeholders, you know, we are defined by our users. We are framed by the natural hazards and the scenarios from those natural hazards in which we find ourselves. This is also contextualised by these various themes that sort of cut across the work that we do. So it is quite a complex world in which we exist, and also influenced by a range of actors. So we have our partner organisations, we have our researchers that actually work with us to, and work with our partners, of course, to produce solutions. We've got the communities that we serve, so their voice needs to also be heard. And ultimately, we need to be producing useful, usable and used solutions. So, you know, that we make our communities safer, more resilient and sustainable in the face of these natural hazards. But also we work with our partners and the community on this research and support better decision making to save lives and protect our communities. So we bring back, you know, these points of concern back to, you know, well, how do we actually react, or how do we action these things? That got me thinking, of course, because I've been sitting over the last 3 days and absolutely furiously writing notes. My computer keyboard's sort of worn out, I think, from all of my efforts. So I've been trying to distill some of the themes that have come out from those 5 key areas or 6 key areas that I just talked about. And have, now this is not exhaustive, so please, I know some things might be missing from your own list of themes, of course, that you've probably all been recording as you've been listening to presentations. But there are some emerging themes, and I call those sort of necessities, right? I think there has been a call to sort of say, these are things that we really do. They're necessary to address. We really can't leave them go. But of course, we're living in the here and now, and we are having to frame responses. We're having to frame mitigation pathways and also recovery pathways right in the here and now, which can't be neglected, of course. And I'm sure that, you know, some of our communities down in Victoria at the moment, the photo from the flooding down in Victoria, you know, shows immediately there's concerns there that has to be responded to. So we have things like complex systemic approaches. That's been a key theme across these 3 days. But we also have specialised research translation that we have to deliver as well. So, and that could be based on jurisdiction, it could be based on particular knowledge or models, could be scaled up or scaled down, could be for a very, very localised response, or it could be for a national response. And also agency focus. So, you know, whether it's fire, whether it's floods and storms, whether it's a health response. We heard a bit about COVID this morning. So these are all quite different types of responses that we need to be able to cater for. We also have the social and the physical connection to First Nations custodianship and accumulated knowledge of country, which of course has been a body of knowledge that's been built up over many thousands of years. But we also have that tension with the notion of scientifically, and I do put that in inverted commas because there's a whole there's debate within the scientific community as to what constitutes scientific supported solutions. So when we heard many different things, right from, you know, hardcore modelling right through to co-design with agencies, with communities for solutions. So there's a whole continuum of different sorts of research that can be applied. We also have diverse place-based disaster management workforce, the notion of, you know, in context workforce, working with the community very closely, which we heard a lot about yesterday afternoon in Blythe's session. But we also then have a need for expert and skilled responders with complex decision-making skills and experience, right? We can't, you know, we have to acknowledge that, yes, that some of this is very highly specialised in nature. And we need to have those people that, you know, they're necessary for our health and well-being and our continuation. We also have transformational adaptation as a theme. You know, how do we actually adapt? And I think that came out very much in the panel this morning, this sort of notion of ongoing adaptation. But then we're also responding to immediate cascading threats and events. So it's sort of, I guess, kind of walking and chewing gum at the same time, right? We're going to have to be doing some of these things all together. We also have a need for a tightly focused research agenda. You know, where do we put the funding? What sort of initiatives are really, you know, something that we need to get behind? But we do also have complex and competing research needs. I don't think there's anybody that's been here for the last 3 days that wouldn't acknowledge that there is a lot of work already going on. There's been a lot of work that has gone on through the CRC to this point. That is quite complex and has been quite necessary and has produced some great outcomes. Resilient and connected communities that are risk aware, adaptable and agile, but then we also have on the other hand resilient connected communities that are risk aware but have self-reliance and also are responsive to warnings and direction. Okay, so there's a little bit of a tension there between those things. Shared philosophies and language. I think Mary O'Kane talked about this, you know, being able to speak the same language and be able to understand one another across various sectorial efforts, but also just in terms of research, you know, researchers to practitioners, they can be talking about quite different, well, they can be talking about the same thing, but you wouldn't know it when if you're sitting in the room listening to them, they're talking about the same thing in quite different ways. And this is versus the specialised expertise and knowledge. So many of our agencies have, you know, very highly specialised areas that they need contributions to. And so there's a bit of a tension there. Effective research data management and access. So what we already know, we've been talking to our partners, our stakeholders, you know, people really do need access to data that we've already collected rather than replicating that. But of course, there is a cost effectiveness issue there, as well as a contextual and temporal issue. So data that's collected under a certain context at a certain time may have different meanings ascribed to it than, you know, if it's tried to be reused at a later date, for instance. Research co-design, that came out in a couple of sessions yesterday. And, you know, this means extensive commitment by everyone involved in the process. And that has to be counterbalanced, though, between the need for fast, cost-effective solution development for time and resource poor users who are under pressure. No doubt the you know, responder organisations and agencies in our sector have been under pressure, sustained pressure now for a very long time. And so how do we balance the need for co-design and getting everybody involved and the time that takes with the stresses on our practitioners? Contextualised warnings and trusted situational awareness. So, you know, a lot of talk yesterday about, well, localised information, localised situational awareness, that's a really big thing. But also the accurate and unambiguous warnings also support trusted situational awareness. Our disaster challenges, number of those groups yesterday were talking really about how do we contextualise in multicultural, quite different linguistic contexts. So again, you know, very complex. How do we tackle these things? Coherent and cohesive disaster response to manage our impact on communities. And I guess this is probably a thing that I think about constantly being a systems person, is that we have these fragmented service chains of government and support organisations to manage operational costs. So some of the flood response comments that we heard from our research group yesterday that have been doing work in that post-flood area talk about, you know, people having to tell and retell their experiences in order to get access to services because things have been fragmented and it's difficult to know who to talk to get what you need to recover. And then ultimately solution translation, ownership and ongoing management and maintenance. Quite often we sort of stop at the door of solution translation and technology transfer. But if it's a system that's been created or a model that's been created and that's been translated for use in practice, then who owns that and how is it updated in an ongoing manner? How is it maintained? How do we know where it is? How do other people coming through doing research know where it is? So these are all very sort of thorny, I guess, complex problems that we need to wrestle with. I guess I see myself in this role as very much a facilitator of conversations amongst my colleagues, certainly in in Natural Hazards Research Australia, but also our stakeholders. So all of you here in the room, to develop research strategies and projects to get us from where we are now to where we want to be in the future. So all of those necessities, you know, we think there's a common concurrence that many of these things, you know, need to be prioritised and need to now come into our research calculations. But how do we get from what we're doing now to where we want to be in the future? So I guess what I want to do is just throw to the audience, I'm just on 15 minutes, so we've got 5 minutes or so, is to just have a bit of a conversation on Slido with all of you. I'm sure you've been able to think over the last few days about various things, and I'm sure there would be opinions out there. How do we navigate these tensions from now into the future? So that's one thing you might like to consider. Where do you find yourself in the conversation? Because remember that I think in Brendan's presentation earlier this morning, he posed some questions to us, you know, the notion of a national disaster response, the notion of community-led efforts for recovery. Is that realistic? How do we enable that? I think the conversation sort of moved on when we had the panel, and I think a few of the comments from the last panel were also about how do we enable community-led efforts. And then short-term response and recovery versus the long-term risk reduction and resilience. And I think I heard a speaker talk earlier on, maybe on the first day, about, you know, where do we invest the money? And in terms of, you know, return on investment, risk reduction and resilience has a very high return. But of course, while we're in recovery mode, many of those resources get diverted to recovery efforts. So how do we move that back into, you know, where we do need to put what are very scarce resources, I guess, is ultimately when we're talking about, you know, how do we invest, what do we invest in, how do we do research? It's really in all of our hands to make decisions about where will we get the best outcomes for that investment. And then how to facilitate the conversation. So what sort of mechanisms would you see would be useful to help us work through this process and actually come out the other end with some very focused projects and you know, moving into some of these areas of necessity? And how do we synthesize and focus our ideas? Because that's the other thing. We've got a lot of, as I say, collective wisdom and knowledge in this room, both from a practitioner point of view, so lived experience, but also from a researcher point of view, where there's been an accumulation of knowledge and wisdom through research, peer review. So we have a very, very powerful group here that I think would be capable of solving many thorny problems, but it's putting mechanisms in place to facilitate the conversation and also to synthesize and focus our ideas for research and translation pathways. So I will turn it over to you guys to think about, you know, comments that you'd like to offer. We will be archiving all of these comments, so we will be able to access your suggestions, your comments, your thoughts as we press forward with what we need to do as well. So thank you.
Thanks, Deb. You've done a fantastic job there to summarise what has been a lot of various conversations during this forum, and we've covered the diversity of our research agenda and to really quite succinctly synthesise the challenges going forward, some of the opportunities there as well, and great also, and keep on putting those comments on Slido as well about how we need to navigate those challenges to find the solutions, because that's what we're all here to do. We're here to find the solutions to all these challenges that we've been talking about, and that's what we need to do through research, innovation and science. So look, I'm not going to take very long here. I'm just going to really encourage you to take the energy that's in the room that everybody's been telling me about when I've been walking up there, and I had lots of meat pies today just to keep me going. for the rest of the forum. But yeah, every time I've been out there, everybody's had something positive to say, which is really nice. But please also give us your feedback as well, and we will have a survey that goes out. But ignite the energy. There's been a lot of ideas shared, a lot of knowledge, a lot of new connections, a lot of new partnerships between different people and different organisations at this forum. So please go away, keep them going, because we, just like one of the comments here up on Slido, we need to keep those conversations going. We need to stay as a group, keep on working together. There's been some great diversity in the room throughout this forum as well. And that is fantastic, because I deliberately use, when I talk about this sector that we work with, as the resilient sector. It is not just people from uniformed agencies, etc., that have been more typical in decades gone by. We are the resilient sector, and that means that we basically take into account the whole of the community in that sense, and we need to be embracing that in our forums, in our research, in our conversations going forward there as well. So engage with us as your centre. We're your national research capability. We take a coordinating role here, but we are all leaders in this space, and encourage you to, we're already being here, stepping up to the plate to face these future challenges, to find the solutions, and really keep on encouraging that leadership, and also encourage others as well in this space to step up and lead and have a go at trying to get these solutions on the table. We're not always going to get this right, and that's okay. Because in trying to do bold things, to solve bold challenges, we do need to take risks. And we can do that through research. We can figure out what's going to work, potentially what's not going to work, and what is actually going to be the best thing for the context that we find, because all contexts and the complexity of these problems are quite huge. So take that energy and drive it forward. I also want to say a few thank yous. Deb's already said some, but very quickly firstly to the team. We've pulled this together really quickly. You've done a fantastic job. Really super proud of everybody. I'm not going to name any particular individual, because everybody at the NHRA team's come together around this and done a superb and great job. So to thank them, from putting together a program, logistics, helping out behind the scenes, everybody's taken a role. So that's been fantastic, and hopefully everybody's seen the NHRA team effort on display here at the forum. I also want to thank all our speakers and panelists. You've done exactly what we wanted you to do. Sometimes you've injected so much passion and energy, we've had to work around and sort of have to reschedule a few things, but that's been great. It's shown to me the passion and the energy that everybody has around the conversation. So thank you for being here. Thank you for coming along. And again, thank you for showing that leadership towards these solutions that we need. And the other one is thank you to you all. As I said, you're all leaders and you've all got an important role. So thank you for coming. We want to see you back at our future forums, and we want you to bring your friends as well. And your colleagues and anybody else you think needs to be part of this conversation. Again, we're a broad church here. We will run future forums. We are super interested to hear from you about what you think the directions of those should be. This one was deliberately broad to focus on our priority research areas, but we want to hear your thoughts about what those should look like to best suit your needs in the future. We are a centre which is centred around our partners and our research providers. We need to be providing events and forums which best suit the needs and which best facilitate the conversations to drive change. So tell us how best they need to work for you. As I mentioned, there will be a survey coming around next week. So that is another way of getting that information back from you to us. So please fill that in, give us that feedback. Give us a call too if you want to speak in more detail. Wrestle me out the front there while I'm having another meat pie before I go as well. And also finally, I just want to say too that the videos that have been captured throughout all the sessions, they'll be made available to everybody as well. So if there's a great session that somebody wants to go back to and make sure they get those messages just right, there's great opportunity there. Again, feel free to share them around to your friends, colleagues, get the energy and the vibe, keep it going up from today. Also, just a thank you again, and a safe journey home to you all. I do know that some of you have got friends and family caught up with the floods in various states as well. So I thank you for coming in safe journey, but also hopefully they're okay and getting through the best they possibly can as well. So thank you, and we'll see you again soon. 1 point from Iain.
Yeah, sorry, just to interrupt, just the chair of the board, Catherine Woodthorpe, could not be here today. She's had to go back for other meetings, but just on behalf of the other board members that are here, can I say thanks to everyone that's organised it, but particularly Catherine. I don't know if we're online, I don't know if Catherine's watching, who was the outgoing chair of the board. She described this as her last hurrah. Please just want to emphasise that she has led, you know, from the CRC, from the beginning of the initial CRC, then through the bushfire and natural hazards, and then through the establishment of this fantastic organisation. So I think it would just be nice to recognise Catherine's effort and thank her for her effort over the years.